Welcome to the Bfap Baseline 2020. My name is Matlo Kalaba and I will be the program facilitator for this program. First and foremost, let me start by apologizing for the delays and the late start. The area where we are, we've been affected by load shedding, and therefore, as a result, some technical challenges also arose. Having done the welcome, this year we are looking forward to a number of things which we haven't done in the past. For example, the presence and the ongoing global pandemic due to the coronavirus has made it such a way that this presentation today comes to you virtually. So it is our 17th Bfap Baseline, but it is our first which is done virtually due to the challenges that are going on globally. So first and foremost, we are going to go through the 10-year presentation, the 10-year outlook of the agricultural sector in South Africa. As a sector, it has also gone through the challenges that the world has gone through. As an economic activity, we have seen some of the employment, income generation abilities, and some of the issues coming up. So it is expected that we will see some of the things that were not reflected in the past. But just getting into the issues is that as you're joining us from all over the world, from South Africa and other parts of the world, the virus has given us an opportunity to reach each and everyone around the globe, and thank you for joining us. We don't take this for granted. I will quickly take you through the outline of our presentation. So the first one that we will have Dr. Ivan Meyer, who is the Minister of Agriculture, Western Cape, to do the opening. He will be followed by Prof. Freddie Meyer, who will be giving us the context and the overview of this year's baseline. And after that, Dr. Tracy Davids will give us the detailed baseline. Marian Delport will give us the data sciences. And then at the end, we will have a panel discussion before closing. So without any waste of time now, I would like to hand over to the Minister, Ivan Meyer, to do the opening.
The Western Cape Department of Agriculture has 5 strategic priorities. Firstly, research, education and training. We are particularly keen to promote work that is evidence-based here in the Western Cape. So research, training and education is a significant strategic priority in the Western Cape. Secondly, continuous support to our farmers. We have about 16,000 farmers here in the Western Cape, and it is important that we support our farmers here in the Western Cape. Thirdly, significantly important given what's happening in South Africa is rural safety. So we also promote rural safety here in the Western Cape. Also significant given the strategic role of the Western Cape Department of Agriculture. We are responsible for 45% of all South Africa's agricultural exports comes from the Western Cape province. So market access, significant strategic priority. And lastly, climate change. Given the fact that we have just come out of the worst drought in 100 years, we need to mitigate the impact of climate change and prepare our farmers for the 4th Industrial Revolution. Given the fact that we are here today to launch the Bfap publication, we are proud because Bfap is evidence-based. It is the leading agricultural research and production value chain publication here in South Africa. We value the contribution of our partners in making sure that we are continuing agricultural production here in the Western Cape based on scientific evidence. What we have seen here during COVID-19 is the significant important role of evidence and research to guide our public policy choices, and Bfap plays a significant role through research, scientific evidence to guide our public policy decisions, not only here in the Western Cape, but all over South Africa. And so, I want to thank all the contributors that played a significant role in this latest publication of Bfap. It is a leading scientific agricultural production magazine and research, we value the contribution of all of the people to make agriculture grow significantly. In 2018, we have seen here in the Western Cape 43 billion rand agricultural value production. All of this for me is significant. Equally, in 2018, we have seen 21 billion rand in revenue. All of this suggests that agriculture is it's resilient, and to make it even more resilient, we rely on research and evidence, as we cannot afford to fail. And so, congratulations to the team for this scientific publication. We are signing off at Elsenburg, the oldest agricultural college here in South Africa, for the love of agriculture.
Thank you, Minister Mohair, for that feedback. We really appreciate the feedback as well as the opening address. Before I hand over to the next presenter, which is Prof. Freddie Mohair, I just need to make a few announcements that are very important. First is that if you want to give us feedback, you want to ask questions, please do so on the comment sections. We are also available on Twitter and other social media, but our Twitter our hashtag is Bfap 2020. It's hashtag Bfap 2020 for our Twitter feed. And finally, I just want to make a point that if you are interested in the book, we have an electronic copy on our website, bfap.co.za. Please go and download it there. Now I would like to hand over to Prof. Freddie Mohair to give us the context and the overview of the agricultural sector, looking both backwards and giving a little bit of what we can look forward to the next 10 years. Prof. Mohair, please.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and again from my side also a great privilege to present to you the Bfap Baseline 2020. In a year where COVID-19 is having a significant impact on the economy, but also on the agriculture sector, we want to present to you an outlook, but also taking a step back and looking at plans that have been made in agriculture. Have these materialized? Should we adjust our growth strategy? What are the opportunities for growth? In this sense, I want to present to a broader context of the agriculture baseline, and more specifically looking at a period where we are now again in a planning phase, what we refer to as the AAMP, the Agriculture and Agro Processing Master Plan. And in this master plan, we are asking ourselves the question, can we bend the curve? Can we generate growth? Can we introduce interventions that can take us beyond what we see in the outlook, in the baseline, what the economic activities are and where their potential growth can be? And the short answer, after 2 hours, if you look at the presentation and if you look at our analyses, the conclusion is this, that yes, there are opportunities for growth. And more importantly, there are opportunities for inclusive growth. And if we introduce very specific interventions, and if we ensure that we actually move from plans into actions, the model that we're presenting actually generates growth of about 12% or 11.8% above baseline projections in the outlook period. But these principles that we've introduced in the model actually take us back to the National Development Plan, where we envisaged 1 million jobs to be created in agriculture. And a lot of times media refers to the expansion of 1 million jobs in export-led industries, which is not correct. The model was actually developed on a 3-tier approach where the smallholder sector and underutilized land, investment in our smallholder and informal sector could actually generate about 400,000 jobs. That was the target. Secondly, your tier of export-led industries, the so-called intensive irrigated industries, the contribution was actually only 250,000 jobs. And the expansion in irrigation was not 500,000 hectares. It was actually built on a model of gaining 10% efficiency, in other words, expanding the irrigation area by 140,000 hectares. Of which, if we look at the expansion over the last 10 years, we've already expanded 70,000 hectares. And we'll get to that table in a moment. The third tier of growth was actually in agro processing. In other words, off-farm jobs. And we need to be analytical about this and understand the consequences that agriculture and primary sector cannot create all the jobs and economic growth that we need to achieve. We need to move off-farm and actually move within the value chains and understand how we can unlock further growth within these processing units, within the export units where we have significant jobs to add. So taking just a brief look at a summary of some of these high growth areas that we identified in the initial National Development Plan. And if we look at the targets, the NDP targets that were set for 2030, for example, citrus, the target was set at 15,000 hectares potential expansion. The citrus sector has actually expanded by 23,000 hectares, already exceeding the target of the National Development Plan. In our next session, if we talk about citrus outlook, we will illustrate the implications because there are huge volumes coming into the market. We need market access, we need infrastructure facilities in the ports, roads, etc. Other sectors that have done also well and actually have exceeded growth, some industry like dairy or like pork, that have grown significantly faster than what we've seen in the NDP projection. So in other words, there are sectors where with the correct combination, with the correct incentives, you can actually generate that growth. And if you look at the trade balance, agriculture's net contribution to the trade balance has actually been very positive, faster than the rest of the economy if we take that into consideration. The sector that's really of a concern is the smallholder sector, and we've seen in periods, in this graph you can see specifically 2016 and 2015, the impact of the severe drought on the sector. There's very little resilience, there's very little coordinated support. Although there's a lot of funding flowing into the sector, not nearly enough traction has been gained in the last 10 years where you can actually see an increasing share of output coming from the sector. So this sector has not been performing as what was initially envisaged in the National Development Plan. And then just lastly, the third sector looks at agro processing. As mentioned, critical sector, about 1/3 of the jobs in the NDP coming from the agro processing sector. So in other words, already acknowledging the importance of value chains. These end-to-end principles where you have a competitive raw material feeding into a processing unit and delivering a cost-effective product for the retail or the consumer. In most of the cases, low-income households. And if we just analyze growth performance of the agro-processing sector, we can see that in the last 10 years, the sector has actually expanded by a faster rate than manufacturing and the overall manufacturing GDP rate that we've seen in the last 10 years. And that's now in constant terms. This sector has expanded by about 2% per annum over the last 10 years. So if we want to then just summarize all of these sectors and we take a more granular approach towards the National Development Plan, we can actually split it out into formal, informal, and commercial and smallholder. And we see the differences. We have a commercial sector which is largely linked to large-scale operations, and this sector has performed relatively well despite of shocks like your droughts, your avian influenza, your foot and mouth disease, your African swine fever. These were all exogenous shocks having an impact on growth. So if you want to provide a more granular summary of the National Development Plan and the 3 tiers of growth, we can actually split it into smallholder and commercial, into formal and into informal. And on this chart, we're actually showing that the commercialized and the more large-scale operations have performed relatively well given the external impacts. And what's very interesting, anecdotal evidence shows us that some of these informal value chains, especially in the secondary jobs creators, the informal sectors have actually done better than what we've anticipated. But this is something that where we need a lot more data and a lot more analyses done, and we'll focus on that in a later session during the baseline launch. Another sector that has done exceptionally well are emerging farmers and new entrants into the space that are linked to the public-private partnerships, where you have well-coordinated programs, support services, finance, linking these farmers into markets. And this category has probably grown the fastest of all, but there's not enough. in this space, and we need to expand on these success cases. And as already mentioned, the smallholder subsistence and the land reform and underutilized land category, that's where we still have vast tracts of land and also unproductive land where we need to provide more support into these sectors. So taking a step back and considering the socio-economic environment in South Africa, we have a population that's urbanizing, and we've got a huge number of low-income households that are trapped in urban areas. To the same extent, we also have a high density of poverty in rural areas. In other words, agriculture can play a significant role in rural areas by creating more economic activity, but in the urban spaces, you need the efficient large-scale value chains to provide safe and cost-effective options for low-income households. And if we look at these value chain options, they are very diverse, and we need to consider these options. We cannot have a model where we force all participants into the same value chain. We need solutions for different types of value chains. This is analysis that was done by Bfap about 4 or 5 years ago, where we analyzed the poultry sector. And we looked at the extreme, at the top of the graph, we see smallholder farmers selling a live bird at 50 Rand. Production costs significantly higher than the bottom of the graph, where you actually see contract growers who need to produce a chicken at about 22 Rand a kilo. Cost structures much more lower, but they're delivering it into a much larger commercialized chain where the volumes are bigger and you're facing increasing competition from competitive imports. If we then turn to the farming system, we see the same diverse nature. And we see these numbers coming from the Census 2017 that was released in March by Statistics South Africa, where we have 40,000 commercial farmers that are VAT registered. And we see a biggest number of farmers actually being in the medium to small and micro space. Micro is even smaller than turnovers of 2 million Rand. But if you look at the job creation and where the biggest employment lies, it's still with the large-scale farmers. And then you get your big numbers in terms of the smallholder farms, where you have about 300,000 small farms and about 2.3 million households that are reporting agriculture activity. So combining farming system and food systems is not something new. And we have seen success cases over the last 10 years, which we refer to as these successful public-private partnerships. And just gives us an illustration of one of those examples or these models. And this was a Jobs Fund model or Jobs Fund project where funding was combined from the public sector and the private sector by the grain industry. And what the two lines are comparing is basically the traditional non-commercial yields that we see coming from the maize farming industry. And if we look at the Crop Estimates Committee, these yields are around about 1.8 to 2 tons per hectare. And if you look in the same farms, if you provide the correct extension services, support, the finances, the markets, the productivity gains are significant, and they're basically doubling their yields, going to about 4 tons per hectare. What's more important out of this picture, however, is on the right-hand side, that these surpluses that are created by the productivity gains are actually flowing into a value chain. So these farmers are producing way beyond what their own household consumption is on the same area. They're actually releasing surpluses into the value chain. And on the right-hand side, the graph shows us that about 44% of these surpluses over the last 4 years actually fed into a value chain where you could see processing, and this is where you can see also the potential for intensification of livestock systems or further processing of products. If we then combine these two principles, and this is a very busy diagram, but if we just keep our focus on these two triangles and we talk about a portfolio approach, and a portfolio approach with a focus to broaden the base and grow the share and output of black participants at all levels of demand and supply. Where you have at the bottom of this diagram on the left, you've got your number of farmers, and on the right-hand side is the volume of food that's produced by that specific category. So to just look at the two extremes, at the bottom, you've got subsistence-orientated smallholders. Their level of support is directly linked to direct government subsidies. And then one step higher, if you're moving into a market-orientated smallholders, linking those into value chains that are already existing, understanding where do we need to improve infrastructure, where do we need to improve finances. And if you look at the right-hand side, as you're moving up into your demand system, the volumes are increasing rapidly. So at the top of the chain, in terms of volumes and requirements, they are very stringent. If we move into export markets, the SPS requirements, traceability requirements, they're just much more stringent and a much higher barrier of entry. And that's where the commercialized operations come in and where they have the benefit and they've got the scale and they've got the support from an existing infrastructure that's already there. What's required at that level is market access to a large extent, or infrastructure development, access to water. The important part is that we grow the share of the black farmers and participants throughout the whole value chain. There are preconditions to all of this. These are models that are not new, as I've mentioned before. We need to focus on the preconditions. And again, these are principles that we've debated also, and that the evidence is there that these principles are critical before the growth will take place. And the first part is capital. Capital investment in an investment-friendly, policy-certain environment. And again, we need to take the diverse nature of farming systems into consideration. So on the right-hand side, the extreme, for example, we've got orchards. They require more than 800,000 Rand of capital investment, very capital intensive. Some of these operations, like for example macadamias, you only get your returns after 8 or 9 years. On the left-hand side, you have capex and opex requirements of maybe a few hundred rands per hectare. These are extensive sheep operations or goat operations in the Karoo. The yields or the gross margins are very low per hectare. You need big farms, big hectares. Maybe 50 Rand a hectare would be your gross margin. On the right-hand side, you can generate a revenue of 100, 150, 200,000 Rand per hectare. But the type of system, the type of support is completely different. And we need to take that into consideration. Then talking about optimization and coordination of public and private, of the private sector. In the graph, we can clearly see that over the years, your spending of government, the focus and the largest share has been in the provinces where we actually have the highest concentration of smallholders or informal markets. So in other words, there is already funding taking place. And the question is, how can we link this funding into private sector initiatives and into value chains that are already existing, but we need to improve on those and optimize the impacts and the investments that we have in these spaces. And if we talk about resources, we consider the nature of South African climate, the marginal nature of our lands. If we map those, the majority of our land is lying at marginal or low potential land. But the reality remains that there are pockets where we still have irrigation that's not utilized, and a lot of those irrigation schemes are actually sitting with smallholders where there is water allocation done, but it needs an investment. And these areas can easily add up to about 30 to 40,000 hectares of idle irrigation schemes. What we have, we need to use more efficiently. And this is just presenting a picture from flyover data from the Western Cape, because in this province they've done flyovers for 2013 and 17, and we can carefully consider some important efficiency gains that we've seen in the irrigation space. For example, under orchards and shade netting, the area has increased by almost 300%. And if we consider vegetables, tunnels have increased by about 43%. So in other words, there's been a significant efficiency gain in using what we have more efficiently, but it requires investment. Then taking another precondition into consideration is policy support. And we've seen these arguments made a number of times. Tariffs are not in a lot of cases a blunt instrument, but in certain cases, and if it's applied correctly, it can make a difference. And we've seen this in the wheat industry, where we've seen rapid decline in the area under wheat production in the last or previous decade. We're actually seeing hectares have stabilized. Now, the decline initially was largely result of climate shifts in the Free State area, but also just risk of farming and then your exposure into the global market. We are net importers of wheat, and we will remain net importers of wheat. But there are areas that can remain in production given the current support system. And what this graph is showing with this increased reference pricing, in other words, where we actually have tariff protection, the hectares remain in production, and we actually have a more stable production environment in the winter rainfall areas. In other words, if we take this data into consideration, we need to be honest on what we can do in terms of import replacement and where we have more growth. For example, in the soybean industry, we are gaining ground on soybean imports, soybean meal imports more specifically, where we've had an investment and we're actually growing the industry and reducing the amount of soybean meal that's being imported. However, we have other industries like wheat, where our natural resource potential limits us to become actually self-sufficient in that space. Yes, we can grow yields. We can do it as efficient as possible as our natural resource potential allows us, but we have limited space. We have benefits again where we can have specific interventions, for example, poultry meat, where a significant amount of poultry meat is imported, but through correct interventions and a competitive grain and oilseed industry, we can actually drive down imports of poultry meat. If we then take the same principle and we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, because in the Agriculture Master Plan, there's a lot of anticipation for what the African Free Trade Agreement could bring for us. But if we consider what are the type of products that Africa is importing, and what's interesting, contrary to what's happening in South Africa, where the agriculture and agro-food processing is a net exporter, Africa is a net importer. And if we look at the type of products that are being imported, it leans towards processed, highly processed product. And then obviously, again, your rice, your wheat are major imported products, as well as palm oil or vegetable oil at large. And there are again opportunities for this region to grow more of it locally, but not only at primary level, but understanding what the interventions and investments need to be in the value chain to create that pull off the farm, to create jobs and revenue on an off-farm basis. Lastly, talking about climate change, such an important element, and it has to speak to all of our research and development programs that we run, the cultivar trials, the investment in genetics, and this graph just presents us the last 120 years of rainfall in the Northwest province. And this is a province, or the western part of the country, where we've seen significant shifts, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, where we've had way below rainfall, and we can see that on the right-hand side of the chart, way below the average of the last 100 years. And this has really influenced a lot of the production patterns in the area. That's influenced the herd sizes, and this is pointing also towards the future in terms of availability of irrigation, availability of farmland, and making sure that we can actually establish new farmers in this space where you already have climate change happening, which a lot of times in certain areas marginalizes your potential for profitable operations. And this then links to our big data generation. And this trial is specifically referring to latest results where Bfap's working with a consortium, a research consortium, and it's showing trial data where you actually have precision planters, precision harvesting equipment. And through this equipment and data, we can actually optimize an understanding of modeling between yield, for example, and fertilizer application, the seeding rates, where traditional research plots would give you maybe 10 observations. With this new technique, you can actually drive 2,400, 2,500 observations, and you can build far more robust models. I want to conclude this section by just summarizing our preconditions for inclusive growth and development. 4 main areas, and these 4 main areas need to be combined by efficient and coordinated institutions and departments. And by departments, we refer also to the 3 tiers of government, your national versus provincial versus municipal government. In other words, the harmony between and the coordinated vision between these different spheres. And if we just summarize these 4 areas, these 4 preconditions, firstly, investments, and we're talking about a investment-friendly environment. whether it's security of land ownership, water, safety at farm level, looking at the support and innovation component, the second precondition, specifically finance, policy support, effective extension services, R&D, information systems that need to be in place. The third tier, infrastructure, we're specifically referring to roads, electricity, fresh produce markets that need to work efficiently for the smaller scale farmers to deliver into these markets. Water infrastructure, port facilities that need to take the produce out that's being produced locally. And then lastly, your markets. Increased market access. We need to be nimble with our market access strategy, bilateral trade agreements, agreeing with industry, between industry and government, what are the priorities, and they are great examples of fruit industry roundtables, vegetable industry roundtables, working together and identifying key areas of growth. I want to conclude this context then just by restating the opportunity for agriculture, where you actually have an opportunity for growth above the baseline that we will see in the next section, where we can invest and we can coordinate in a way that will benefit the industry at large.
Thank you very much, Freddie, for that overview as well as the context of the agricultural sector. I think you presented a very good picture of how the sector has performed during this period, as well as the interaction with the overall economy. Precisely, I appreciate the fact that you nailed the key points around what are the issues that needs to be done in order to have a much better future, particularly issues around the preconditions for having an inclusive growth, and agriculture can play a very important role in that. Now, having listened to Freddie presenting the overview, I would like now to turn to Tracy, Dr. Tracy Davis, who will now look into the industry as well as the product-specific issues, where she will delve deeper into some of the factors that happened as well as the drivers as we look into the 10-year outlook of this baseline. Tracy?
Thank you very much, Matlo. As always, it's a great pleasure to present to you our 10-year view for the agricultural sector and where it's headed. Of course, this year, COVID-19 has clouded it in a lot more uncertainty that might normally have been the case. But it's also given us the opportunity to think about agriculture's role and where it fits in the economy and how it can assist to put South Africa on a more sustainable growth path going forward. So I'll start off with the chart that you've already seen from Fadi, but present maybe a little bit more detail. And on screen, you've got the real agricultural GDP in South Africa since 2000 and also over the outlook period. And what we see is that agriculture by its nature is a very volatile sector. So we've had a lot of up and down periods. Historically, we've had periods of decline, which were always followed by some recovery and good growth. In many instances, this was supported by a range of international factors, in 2006, 7, 8, we had the introduction of biofuels, we had a Chinese economy growing very quickly. In 2012-13, we had climatic conditions in the US which supported price levels. But we've also had a period from 2010 through to 2016 where we really had sustained investment into South Africa's agricultural sector and strong export-driven growth. So if we think about the future and where we're going, we have to consider again the international environment. We've got an environment where we have high stock levels following a period of multiple years of above average production. And we've also now, post-COVID, got a low growth environment from a macroeconomic perspective, so the demand prospects are much weaker than what they might have been a while ago. Domestically, similarly, we've got in 2020 good support from the exchange rate. So while we had some sectors doing exceptionally well, we have, for instance, the second largest summer crop on record. We also had exchange rate supporting prices and supporting prices for good, strong horticultural crops. And so the sector is performing very well in 2020. But after that, when we return to more normal volumes, we also hit by the reality of this low economic growth environment and weak demand prospects. So for that reason, the sector is pretty flat for the first half of the outlook. Over the second half, we do start to get some recovery. This is also when global stocks normalize, the economic environment starts to recover a little bit, and our animal feed and horticulture sectors in particular start to perform better. If we look then to the subsectors, we've got now on screen just a stacked bar that shows you the contribution of various subsectors to South Africa's economy or the agricultural economy. Livestock typically about half of the sector in terms of revenue, and then we've got about 25% attributed to field crops and also to horticulture. So if we look then at performance over time, you'll see on screen again the real gross production value from the three main subsectors in South African agriculture. And strikingly, field crops is obviously a lot more volatile than the other two, and that has to do with a lot of the production taking place under dryland conditions. Accordingly, the production and the volumes are a lot more volatile. And we also see that in the past few years, the real value from the sector has actually showed a strong declining trend. In 2020, we do have some recovery. We have, of course, a good crop coming in, our summer crop, good volume. While that would normally put prices down to export parity levels, this year that level is also supported by the weak exchange rate. And so the year-on-year decline that we might normally have seen when we get such a big crop doesn't actually occur. Going forward, when the volumes normalize, we see then that the sector also returns to this longer-term declining trend. If we look towards animal products, this is a sector that really benefits from this declining trend on the field crop side. So the sector has performed quite well and quite consistently over the past decade. But then in 2020, owing to its sensitivity to consumer spending power and also a lot of the food service industry being closed through the lockdown period, we actually see a decline in the revenue from the animal product sector. Going forward, we do see some recovery, firstly driven in the early years by poultry and some actions implemented there from the Poultry Master Plan, and in the second half of the outlook by the beef sector, which is very much based on export-driven success. The star performer then from the past decade is horticulture, and we'll see a really rapid increase from 2006 all the way through to 2014, where the sector performed very well. In recent years, it has been influenced by weather conditions, so drought conditions in the Western Cape in particular, making life a little bit difficult. In 2020, we have again the biggest citrus crop in a very long time. This, together with prices which again have held firm in the international market as consumers look towards product with high vitamin C content, and also the weak exchange rate, which has supported prices and consequently revenue in that sector. Those conditions are expected to normalize in the short term, but in the longer term, we are still looking at growth with a lot of additional volume coming into the horticultural sector. In terms of key success factors that might assist us to get to this accelerated growth scenario, on animal product side, we really have to look at animal health and the general competitiveness of the trade environment. If we can improve the general health status of our herd, that will enable us to grow faster, to export more products into the global market. From the horticultural side, we have got good volumes coming into production, but we need to make sure that we have good enough market access for these products to go into. We need to make sure that we have the infrastructure to support the volumes coming through the market and also to get a good value for those products. In terms of field crops then, in a sector where revenue is coming under increasing pressure, it of course all becomes about productivity gains. So we need to look at sustainable rotation systems and diversification within that mix. Having said that, for all of them, all of these contributors are really aimed at creating an environment that's economically sustainable. But then we also have to think of inclusivity and all the idle resources that we have that we can bring into production. We want to make sure that we bring those resources and those new producers into an environment that's doing well economically and has prospects for success going forward. So COVID-19 really has changed the world we live in, and in terms of its impact on the agricultural sector, you can really separate those into three tiers. Firstly, from a value chain interruptions perspective, we've had lockdown measures imposed. In many instances, this has limited trade, not in agriculture per se, but in many of the support services which allow agriculture to operate efficiently. There's of course the risk of disease outbreaks among employees, the social distancing requirements which limit the capacity in many of the processing facilities. But in general, agriculture has really risen to the occasion, where we've seen some price volatility associated with these availability spikes. The sector's done well and ensured that we have food on the shelves in a fairly uninterrupted manner. The longer term aspect is the economic environment and the impact that the lockdown action has had. So this of course influences the disposable income of your consumers and the ability to afford food. You have lagging unemployment, and while this impact on the economic front is more indirect, it's much longer term, and then we end up in a situation where prices are a little bit weaker because the demand prospects are not that good. The third one is of course the policy response to all that. Internationally, we've seen some countries responding by restricting trade volumes. So we're expecting that countries, with COVID having shown up some logistical challenges and risks associated with international trade in periods such as this, we do expect that some countries will push domestic production, support domestic production growth, so that maybe they're less reliant on international trade, resulting in a broader shift in global trade patterns. So if we look at the impact of COVID on food prices, that volatility is already evident. So on screen you've got the FAO food price index for specific commodity groups. And you can see there that the striking ones are vegetable oils and sugar, where prices had increased towards the end of last year based on supply concerns. When the lockdown action was imposed and the demand side weakened drastically very quickly, those prices really plummeted, and that's to a big extent associated with industrial demand. So cereals, which is a more basic food staple, prices have remained more consistent, but then you've got meat and dairy products where your consumer is again more sensitive. We saw prices decline quite significantly in the international market. If we look then at some work done by our colleagues from the OECD and the FAO, you'll see an interesting scenario where the solid lines represent what international vegetable oil and poultry prices might have looked like pre-COVID-19 or the baseline. The dotted line then shows a change or an alternative scenario where the macroeconomic effect of COVID-19 is incorporated. The shaded area at the back presents a range of scenarios which might have occurred if one looks at historic volatility around the baseline projection. And what this really shows us is that for both vegetable oil and poultry, prices actually declined beyond that level of what one might have expected given the historic volatility in the sector. So in terms of the global macroeconomic environment, on screen we're comparing the 2008 and 2009, the global financial crisis, to the current situation based on the June projections from the IMF. What's clear there is that the global economy, while it did decline marginally in 2009 with the financial crisis, a lot of this was actually centered in a few advanced economies. It was a very specific thing that went wrong. Whereas 2020, we're looking at a situation where the supply side and the demand side have been impacted. We've got advanced economies and emerging economies impacted, and we're looking at a global reduction or global contraction of around 5%. The OECD has this contraction at 6%. So there's a range of projections there, but the sheer magnitude of this shock is way, way bigger than what we saw through the global financial crisis. For South Africa then, we're showing you on screen an index of the real GDP, and you can see the big decline happening in 2020. So while we did see growth slow over the past few years based on a lot of structural challenges in South Africa's economy, the COVID-19 impact has really just accelerated and made a lot of those impacts worse. So we're looking at a contraction of around 9.5% in 2020, with a slow, prolonged recovery and only getting to the actual GDP level of 2019 by 2026. At the same time, the general risk aversion evident in the global economy has resulted in quite a severe depreciation in South Africa's exchange rate. This, of course, has supported prices for many of our agricultural products. Going forward, we do expect some recovery and a much flatter growth path going forward, with some stronger depreciation in the second half of the outlook. So on screen, you've got South Africa's population disaggregated by expenditure decile, and then summed up into three broader groupings of low-income households, middle-income households, and affluent households. So the lowest 40% of the population there, these are the share of the population that's spending roughly 30% of their income on food products. And these are the consumers that have been hardest hit also from an income perspective. A recent survey conducted on 10,000 South African households indicated that up to 47% of people ran out of money for food in April. If you compare that to the household surveys conducted in 2018, that number was only 21%. So this really points to quite a significant humanitarian crisis arising from this current situation that we find ourselves in. Of course, beyond income dynamics, there's also population dynamics to consider when one thinks of the demand structure in the agricultural system. On screen, you've got a heat map which shows the extent of urbanization in South Africa's population in 2011, which was the last time we had a population census done. Since then, we've increased the share of population residing in urban areas from 61% to around 66%, and by the end of the coming decade, that's expected to increase to 71%. So normally, when consumers move to the more urban centers, they do so looking for a higher income and better living environment. One then sees changes in the dietary composition, so you see consumers moving to products that have a higher convenience factor. They generally have better access to things like refrigeration, so the product mix can diversify. But all of that is, of course, also dependent on them actually being successful in attaining a higher income and getting a job in the urban centres. In South Africa, with a higher unemployment rate, you do often end up with a situation where people move to the cities, they're unable to find a job, and they've now lost the production prospects that they had in the rural areas to supply some food for themselves. So many of them actually ending up worse off. Of course, there's also the need to consider the sheer size of the population. So on screen now, in the bar chart on the right, you've got population growth historically. So over the past decade, our population expanded by around 19%. To 2025, we're expecting to add another 9%, and by 2030, another 5% to that. So this, of course, adds additional consumers, adding additional demand, but much of the structure of that demand and the products that will be demanded depends then on the success of that growing working age population in finding employment. So how these changes in income affects the dietary patterns that we see amongst consumers becomes quite clear if one looks at evidence from the Income Expenditure Survey in South Africa. There's some distinct product groupings. If you look at fresh cabbage and maize meal, for instance, as consumers move from the marginalized to the middle income to the more affluent groupings, they actually spend less money on these basic staple type products. For another group then, we've got a situation where your consumer, as he moves from a marginal to a middle to a higher income, you originally would consume more of the product or spend more on the product, and then that declines again as you go to your more affluent groups. Much of that is often associated with health concerns, and then the last grouping speaks very much to your more luxury type products. So here you've got cheese, you've got your more processed products, and specifically also meats, where as you move from lower to middle to higher income groups, you actually spend quite significantly more on these products. In some cases that entails buying more quantity, but in some cases that also entails changing the product mix within these products. So maybe moving from your cheaper to your more expensive beef cuts. So on that note, we can then move on to the more detailed look at the outlook for South Africa's animal products. These are the products that we've just seen are particularly sensitive to changes in consumer income levels, and so if we look to demand over the coming decade, we see quite a drastic slowdown relative to what we've seen in the past. This doesn't mean that there's no prospects for production growth. However, we do have some sectors which are very competitive and can look beyond our own market to grow very much based on an export-led approach. And we also have others which have formulated very coordinated strategies to allow them to replace imports going forward. In order to do this, we must prioritize productivity, and we also need to make sure that we improve the general health status of our herd. Turning again first to international markets, we've got on screen the FAO meat price index, so then just showing relative movements of different meat types in the international market. And what's clear that from the beginning of the year, when the COVID-19 impact hit, prices have declined quite drastically. We have seen some turnaround in lamb prices in particular, as supply has been constrained for some time, and as some countries start to raise import demand again as they come out of lockdown, we have seen some increases there, but particularly your lower priced products, things like pork and poultry, prices have declined quite drastically. If you relate that to South Africa, however, we have had quite a strong offsetting impact from the exchange rate. So while we saw meat prices globally decline quite substantially, in South Africa we saw small declines for beef, or comparatively small declines for beef and pork, but poultry prices have actually held up fairly well, being based predominantly on import parity levels. And lamb prices, while they decreased initially under the lockdown situation, they have actually recovered quite strongly since. So if we look towards this meat consumption growth, what you see on screen is a comparison of average consumption levels for each specific meat type from 2017 to 2019, and we compare to that then 2029 at the end of the outlook period. What's clear from the beginning is the dominance of chicken within the broader meat sector, so it's the most affordable meat type, and for many it represents the entry point into the meat market. For that reason, it's also critical in this lower income environment. Historically, over the past decade, we saw about a 25% expansion in chicken consumption, and over the coming decade, we expect that to slow quite significantly to 12%, but with production increasing and South Africa able to reduce the share of imports in our total market space. Beef is the second biggest product, and here we have an interesting situation. If you think historically, our beef consumption actually increased very drastically. In the decade preceding 2016, it increased by 17%. But then post-2016, where we had the big drought and we were facing some supply constraints, we saw prices increase quite rapidly and demand or consumption actually then decreased again by 8%. Looking forward to the next decade, we do expect additional supply to enter the market, which would normalize prices in real terms, and so we foresee growth of 12% over the projection period within the beef sector. Pork is a small meat in terms of consumption volumes, but it's an industry that's grown very rapidly in the past. So over the past decade, we saw growth of around 40% in pork consumption. Over the outlook, that's projected to slow to around 20%. But this industry, of course, consumption on a per capita basis is still very small, and it's an industry where we do still foresee more growth if we can get certain factors right. The interesting one is sheep, which is a sector which also over the past decade has actually been in decline. So from a production perspective, they're faced with multiple challenges in terms of climate, but also in terms of theft, livestock theft and predation in the areas that we produce. So going forward, this is the most expensive meat type, so we do have a sensitive reaction in terms of income levels. But we also see prices increasing further over the outlook because of that supply constraint. So all things considered, then we see consumption of sheep actually declining by 11%. And if one thinks around turnaround strategies and what the possibilities are to get the sector growing again, you almost need to look to a sector like beef, which drove the turnaround based on accessing export markets and exporting premium products. So in terms of consumption growth, we've said a lot about income levels, but there's also relative affordability to consider. And in that respect, you have products such as beef, which is actually generally a more expensive meat type if you think in terms of carcass prices. But in retail level, it's got quite a range of products. So you've got beef offal in the affordable meat cluster, you've got beef mince in your middle price cluster, and then you've got beef fillet in your luxury cluster. So we have to acknowledge also that within each meat type, there are different products which are aimed at different consumer target markets. If we look then also on the expenditure that we see on the relative meat products, you'll see that something like lamb, which is generally most expensive, the bulk of the expenditure on lamb products is coming from your more affluent consumer base. As you move right then towards beef products and ultimately eggs and chicken, your most affordable protein source, you have a rising share of expenditure coming from your low-income households. The interesting one here is pork, because despite being quite an affordable meat type, you actually have quite a big share of your expenditure coming from your affluent consumer base. And this has a lot to do also with the level of processing and the value added to the product prior to consumption. But for pork, there's also multiple other factors that affect consumption that don't speak specifically to economics, to income and price levels. On screen, we compare meat consumption in South Africa to what we see on average around the world. From there, it's clear that while pork globally is as important as chicken, constituting 37% of your meat consumption mix, in South Africa it's really small, accounting for only 8%, with 65% coming from chicken. Now, much of this has to do with cultural reasons as well, and there's some religious dynamics to consider of people that don't consume pork. But generally, it's also a product that's not so well known to a broad part of South Africa's consumer base. And recently, we did some work funded by the RMRD South Africa, which looked specifically at consumer expectations and consumer concerns related to pork products. So amongst the expectations of what consumers want to see from pork were factors such as affordability, value for money, especially also food safety, freshness, visual appeal, a lot of these factors speaking to quality and integrity aspects. On the concern side, raised across the socio-economic spectrum, again, was quality. People perceived pork to have a high fat content, many saying it has a bad smell, that it's a dry meat. There was also concerns raised to food safety. And what this all points to is that for a sector where per capita consumption is still low, there's actually a lot of scope to improve the image per se of the product if one can really ensure the integrity of pork products and market it to consumers to overcome these perceptions. There's a lot of scope for consumption growth within that sector. Pork is also interesting because it has a very big informal component. So what we've spoken to earlier speaks very much to products procured through the formal value chain in retail stores. But if you look at household level information in South Africa, you see that in addition to our formal sector, we've actually got more than 200,000 households engaged in pig farming. That amounts to almost 900,000 pigs within this sector, and if you equate that to what we know about the formal sector and the number of pigs in that, it suggests that 38% of our national standing stock is actually within the informal sector, and a very small share of that actually moves through abattoirs and through the formal processing sector. A lot of it is sold live, directly to consumers, And what it suggests is that we're actually undercounting our pork production and consequently also pork consumption numbers by around 10%. If we look towards the pork market outlook then, we have a lot of factors to consider again. So we've got on screen on the chart, we've got the area at the back which shows pork consumption historically and also pork production historically and also over the outlook period. We've got the bar indicating imports. And then as an indicator of relative profitability, we've got the pork to maize price ratio. So there again, we see a lot of volatility. We see that from the period between 2013 through 2016, where we had high feed prices, we had drought conditions influencing our feed grain sector, that ratio fell very low. In 2017, when we had the bumper crop, it recovered to an all-time high. So we have seen profitability increase, but then in recent years, we've also had some dynamics associated with listeria, things like African swine fever, foot and mouth disease, which has put pressure on pork prices. Going forward, that profitability ratio does recover, and a lot of that is based on the fact that the productivity gains achieved in the maize sector is actually faster than what we've seen in the meat sectors. So we have real maize prices declining over the outlook, whereas our real meat prices remain fairly consistent. That's not to say that we haven't had productivity growth in the meat sectors. Pork, for instance, over the last decade, we saw herd numbers decline actually by 11%, but at the same time, production increased by almost 50%. Over the outlook then, with your profitability ratio stabilizing at levels better than what we saw in 2015-16, but not quite the highs of 2017 and 18, we see production growth of around 2% per annum. This is sufficient to replace some of the imports that are coming into the market. We can also arguably do more in that respect if we can improve animal health and biosecurity, particularly in the informal herd where we have a lot of scope for productivity gains. But the reality is also that South Africa imports a very specific products in the form of pork ribs, and those are unlikely to go away because it plays a role in balancing the market, so to speak. If we look towards chicken then, this is of course the other industry which is very dependent on the feed grain sectors for its own competitiveness. And if we just take a look historically from 2000 to 2010, South Africa added about 700,000 tonnes in chicken consumption. Of that, 86% was supplied by domestic producers. If we move to the next decade, we added around 500,000 tonnes to domestic consumption, but the turnaround here is of that additional growth, only 43% was supplied by domestic producers with the balance imported. So this suggests that we've really struggled to compete with imported products, and if we break that down looking at what exactly those products are, we see that the bulk of growth in import volumes has been attributed to bone-in portions. In this extent, then the product that competes very directly with individual quick frozen portions in South Africa, which accounts for about 65% of South Africa's chicken market. The industry, through this struggle with imports and being classified as an industry in distress, went through a process of formulating a master plan designed with very specific goals of containing imports and growing domestic production. So there's a combination of actions proposed in this master plan to assist the industry. A lot of it has to do with the trade environment. So we've got a review of tariffs, we've got the legislative framework which speaks to labeling and traceability, putting those products on very equal footing to what's expected from domestically produced products. We've also got a framework which enables SPS compliance so that we can export breast meat. If we can export breast meat at a premium, that'll allow us to compete more efficiently with the bone-in portions, which is where we traditionally struggle. And then there's also very specific actions in addition to imports that speaks to growing productivity and increasing production, not only amongst our big producers, but also amongst our smaller, more informal producers. Of course, productivity is key if one wants to achieve this, and so we're showing on screen the relative cost of production in specific set of countries compared to South Africa. So you'll see by the countries on the left that most of the European countries, it's more expensive to produce a chicken carcass than what it is in South Africa. But if you look towards the right, countries such as the USA, Brazil, Thailand, Ukraine, which are big exporters in the global market, they're still able to produce a carcass cheaper than what we can in South Africa. And a lot of that has to do with them being net exporters of feed products, which then in turn reduces their cost of production. The reality is, though, that South Africa has an advantage compared to these other countries when it comes to the EU specifically. So we have the Economic Partnership Agreement, under which we have preferential tariff access to the EU market. So if we are able to produce relatively competitively, we should be able to access this market, particularly for higher value and higher priced products such as your chicken breasts. We haven't done that to date, mainly because we are unable to comply with food safety and SPS related measures. The industry strategy going forward is firstly to put the framework in place to enable this compliance, but also to look towards more value-added products where we can add some value and cook some products before we export them, which then makes it easier to comply with the SPS measures. These products would then be targeted very specifically at the EU, but also in the Middle East, where South Africa has become quite competitive in terms of supplying meat products. So the impact of all of that, if we look then towards the outlook for chicken production, we see that the very similar trend in the chicken to maize price ratio than what we saw for pork. So the drastic recovery in that profitability ratio in 2017 and particularly 2018, those factors combined with the actions underlying in the poultry master plan then give us quite significant growth over the next few years in poultry production. Over the second half of the outlook, that slows again, and with the recent introduction or the recent increases in the tariff rates combined with the weak exchange rate, we have seen some price support, making imported products relatively more expensive. So we see some reduction in imports in the short term, but in the longer term still remaining a factor, not going completely away, but certainly also not growing at the rate that what we've seen historically. Poultry traditionally is not a sector that's associated with inclusivity. It's obviously an industry that depends on scale of production, so we've got quite a concentrated industry producing in a highly integrated value chain, achieving top efficiency levels, but requiring scale to enable the investment into this top production technology. The other side is that we also have more than 1 million households active in poultry production. If you look towards the map on the right, you'll see that a lot of these producers are also situated in the rural areas. So while there's many of them, they produce at a much lower scale and so contribute a much smaller share to total production. They are also faced with challenges in terms of input costs. Input costs tend to be higher because you can't procure in bulk, and it's also expensive to move the inputs into these rural areas. So if we can enable grain production in these areas and grain processing, if we can give them better access to cheaper inputs, if we can broaden their markets by making available slaughtering facilities and storage facilities in terms of refrigeration, we really can expand their market, allow them to produce a cheaper bird and expand their market in these rural areas. So if we move on from the import replacement strategies then into the more export-led development, we look at beef, which has really been one of the success stories in South African agriculture over the past decade. On the map, you see the change in South Africa's beef exports over the last 10 years. The green showing where we had a higher increase in our export volumes. A lot of that growth has been targeted towards China, which in the process has become the biggest share of South Africa's total beef exports over the past few years. Growth has also occurred into the Middle East region, and the products that we export into these regions are very much your higher value products, your more expensive, so we obtain a good premium in these markets. At the same time, we've reduced exports into some of our neighboring countries a little bit because the mix of products demanded in these countries is quite distinctly different. So if you look on the chart on the right, showing the composition of South Africa's beef exports on average from 2010 to 2012 and comparing that to 2017 to 2019, you'll see a lot of the growth has occurred in boneless cuts, some bone-in cuts as well, but predominantly fresh and frozen boneless cuts. The strategy here is very much then associated with an optimization of the beef carcass value. So what producers have done is they've exported cuts typically associated with the hindquarter, done that into markets where they can obtain a good premium for that, and the rest of the carcass or the forequarter products then come into the South African market and also some into neighboring countries, and the premium that we obtain for the higher value cuts then enables us to sell these cheaper cuts locally at a more affordable price. So if we look towards the beef market outlook then, we've got again production shaded into the back, we've got some profitability ratios, we've got the beef to maize ratio, and in this instance also the beef to calf ratio. And if you look at those, you'll see that it's really been a volatile period for the industry over the last 10 years. So while we have attained average annual growth of around 2%, a lot of that came leading up to 2016. The drought conditions then forced us to slaughter into our breeding herd. So for the next few years, we entered a rebuilding cycle, particularly also when production became more profitable in 2017. That cycle unfortunately takes some time. So we have been in that cycle for a while, and over the next 2 to 3 years, we expect some of that supply to start entering the market, which will of course also affect our beef prices. In terms of growth going forward, we're expecting production growth of around 1.4% per annum, a lot of that underpinned by growth in exports. Our exports over time have also been challenged by disease outbreak. We saw in 2019 when we had the foot and mouth disease outbreaks that exports halted suddenly and had quite a significant price impact. Since then, based on compartmentalization, some of the feedlots have been able to negotiate bilateral agreements with trade partners. And while we still haven't been declared free of foot and mouth disease again, we have actually started exporting beef again. So going forward, that beef to maize price ratio also improves over time, again based on the real decline in feed grain prices. This improving ratio then also enables our feedlots to pay a bit more for the calves, which in turn benefits your smaller producers, which can supply weaner calves into the system. The other industry that's done very well in the export market is wool. So if you look historically, South Africa in 2009 exported about 35,000 tons of wool. We managed to grow that to almost 50,000 tons by 2018. In 2019, we had a sharp reduction also associated with foot and mouth disease, but the inherent traceability possibilities within the industry has also then enabled it for exports to resume again. Although a lot of the product which might have been exported in 2019 only actually left the country in the following season, so we've got a big spike. Going forward, we do expect that growth to slow. Firstly, that's because production growth slows over the outlook based on challenges such as theft and predation, but also because a lot of the historic growth in exports was based on a redirection of products that might originally have been processed in South Africa and instead were targeted into the export market, where South Africa's high quality wool actually fetches a premium over most of the other countries that we compete with. We have reached a bit of the limit in terms of that strategy. However, currently we only process around 3% of our domestic wool clip locally, and so a further redirection strategy is not necessarily possible over the outlook. So the other product where South Africa has been very successful in the export market is mohair. We actually supply 47% of the global mohair market, and we do so also with a very high quality product which typically fetches a premium in the global market. The real success story with wool, however, is not only the growth that they've shown, but also the inclusivity of this growth. So if you look at the chart on the left, it shows you the contribution to total wool production from large-scale commercial producers and our communal areas. And you'll see over time from the early 2000s, that share has actually increased quite significantly. On average, for the past 3 years, we supplied roughly 5,000 tons of wool from these communal producers. If you look towards the right, that also shows the national average wool price and compares it to the price attained by these communal producers. And the grey line then shows you the ratio between these two prices. And what we see is that over time, the communal prices have actually caught up to the national average price. So that premium has actually declined over time. So that would indicate that your communal producers have caught up in terms of quality, producing a higher quality wool that's more comparable in your national framework. But that's not to say that it can't be improved further. So in many cases, these producers are too small, and the clip has to be combined within the shearing sheds with a lower quality wool, which then doesn't enable them to get the full value for the wool that they have, the quality wool that they have produced. We've spoken a lot about expansion, particularly from our extensive livestock sectors, but the reality is that we have to also consider the resource base. So on the left, we're showing a view towards grazing potential in South Africa. So all the green and yellow areas reflect possible grazing potential. The black areas reflect planted pasture, which we can then look at. The red area is South Africa's crops currently being produced. On the right then, we've indicated the major extensive livestock. So we've got beef or cattle in general, we've got goats and we've got sheep. And we've expressed them all into large livestock units. So essentially this gives you some view to the demand for grazing, so to speak. What's concerning, if you look at that, is that the high density area of livestock overlies very well with the white areas in your potential grazing chart, which is actually areas that are already under pressure. So these areas are either built up, or you've got erosion, you've got degradation of your quality. The areas have already been overgrazed. And the concern is that these high livestock density within these areas will also only make these challenges worse going forward. So the other sector that's also dependent on this grazing is, of course, dairy. So here we've got a very interesting sector. If you look towards the past decade, we've seen a lot of consolidation in terms of producer numbers. So the number of producers in the sector has actually declined by 65%. But at the same time, milk production increased by more than 30%, and we saw also earlier in Fadi's presentation that the sector has actually already exceeded the growth targets that were set for it under the National Development Plan. So that equates to growth of about 2.9% per annum over the past decade. This is a very finely balanced industry. It's fairly competitive in the global context, but demand and supply is very balanced, so prices can be volatile. And we've seen a lot of pressure in terms of costs and actual product prices in the past. This is also one of the reasons why we've seen this consolidation, as the producers that have remained in the sector are those that are able to invest in top production technology, produce at scale, and can therefore ride out these cycles a little bit better. One also has to note that the consumer base for dairy products differ. So if you look at the composition in the back of dairy product consumption, we've got around 40% going to concentrated dairy products and around 60% going to liquid dairy products. So your liquid dairy products would be your fresh milk, your UHT milk, and then a little bit of value-added products such as yogurt. But this would be a big supply into your lower income levels, and then your more concentrated products, your cheese, your milk powders, and your butter would be targeted more towards your higher income consumers. So to wrap up the animal product sector, we then want to speak to a few key factors that we feel really can accelerate growth in the sector. The first relates specifically to the general status, South Africa's herd health. That goes hand in hand with the livestock traceability system. So this will enable us to better understand our smaller producers, where they are, how they do business, and quantify their contribution. It'll also enable us to manage our diseases much better, and that in turn then broadens our access to markets for our exported products. The other side is that major productivity gains are possible, specifically in the informal sector amongst our smaller producers. But we also have to make sure that these producers have efficient, transparent markets to deliver into, and we need to make sure that we do the recent research and development to actually attain this productivity growth. We need to make sure that we compete on a level playing field. This speaks specifically to imports, but also to the fact that we need to be able to certify, and we need a framework to enable us to comply with food safety and SPS regulations and also access broader export markets. Other than that, we need a comprehensive support system for our emerging producers, and that in many instances includes infrastructural development as well as a broader market space. Moving on to field crops then, here we've got a subsector where, despite the challenges presented by COVID-19, has actually had a very good 2020 season. The volumes have increased sharply year on year, and prices have also got support from the weaker exchange rate. Despite that, we still need to remember that many of our Western production regions are under quite severe pressure. They've had a number of difficult years, so producers in these regions are looking to alternatives, and we do see a structural shift there in terms of production patterns. Going forward, we have to acknowledge that crop rotation, diversification, and continued research and development to keep us on top of the productivity curve will be critical for sustainability. If we start again with global markets, what we're showing on screen is we're again comparing the time around the global financial crisis, which was of course the last time where we had a big demand shock to the global market. And we compare that to current levels in terms of stock to usage ratios. And what we see is that for the most part, agricultural markets are much better stocked than what they were just following the global financial crisis. This would suggest that prices may dip lower this time than what we actually saw in the financial crisis. If we look towards the right then, and the world price impacts that we have seen to date, we actually have seen some grain prices increase, and a lot of this has to do with policy responses. So the big one that increased was rice, and that has to do with some key exporters limiting exports from their countries in order to ensure domestic supply for their own consumers. For products that are more related to feeds, products such as maize, where we've seen quite a sharp decline in industrial demand in particular, we have seen prices decline. If one looks towards the region then, we also have to say that we have substantial opportunities for trade into Africa. Fadi mentioned this earlier. On the left, we're showing the SADC region. We're showing the region as a whole in dark blue, and in the lighter blue is the rest of the SADC region once South Africa has been removed. What that essentially illustrates is that South Africa is a critical player and a very big positive contributor to the trade balance within the SADC region. If we look towards the right, then we see that the African Union, that's still well negative in terms of trade balance, and while we have seen it improve a little bit over the past decade, still a region that's importing a lot of food products. And this is important because it speaks to the upcoming African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So this agreement, of course, has been delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic, But over the 10-year outlook, we do still expect it to come into force and then to provide additional opportunities and market space for South Africa. If we refer back to Ferdy's presentation earlier, you have to note though that we need to get the product mix right. So one of the products that we do currently export into the region is white maize. On the bar chart on the left, we're showing you white maize monthly exports from March to June. So this is of course the period that's been affected by the lockdown action. We've heard of a lot of challenges at border posts, products moving slowly through border posts as it's being exported into the region. But in general, with the big maize crop that we've had locally, we have seen that volumes into Africa have been much stronger than what we saw in the past few years. In June, however, the volumes exported into the rest of the world have been much higher than these regional exports. Part of that also has to do with prices. So if you look at maize prices across the African region on the right, you really see exceptional volatility in these markets. And this is a key factor because it just presents a difficult environment for South African producers to compete in. So you'll see in 2020 in particular, in recent months when the new crop came in, prices declining quite drastically, particularly true in Zambia. And Zambia, of course, is one country that's competing more and more efficiently with South Africa in terms of supplying maize into the region. So coming towards the outlook for white maize, then we see that over the projection period, we've got the share of exports in the total market actually declining over time. Now, this is partly attributed to the increasing competition that we face from Zambia, with Zambia having a more favorable transport differential into markets such as Zimbabwe, and with their non-GM maize obviously being very competitive compared to South African products. But the other side of that is also that we've got a generally weaker economic environment, and where we saw over the past 10 years that per capita maize consumption in South Africa has actually declined fairly consistently, we see that turning around over the outlook, particularly the early years of the outlook, with your consumer under significant pressure and shifting back to basic food staples, reversing some of the dietary diversification that we've seen in the past. The drop to export parity prices, however, coming off the strong production volumes, that is important and very critical for our consumers. So it's good news, obviously, from a consumer perspective, as it keeps the product fairly affordable. But it also, the reality of trading at export parity prices for a long time is that there's a significant share of more marginal area in the western parts of the country where this is just not a sustainable option. And when prices tend towards export parity, these producers come under pressure, and over the outlook we do expect that we will lose around 200,000 of these hectares going forward. Here we show the impact of that profitability. So what you've got on screen is a basic cash flow comparison in the western production regions in South Africa. It's split into three. So we've got normal or average production regions, we've got the higher potential regions, and then we've got these more marginal regions. What we see is that the good yields attained in 2020 have actually pushed cash flow positive for all these regions, having been negative in 2018 and 2019. But if we go forward with prices sticking to export parity levels and yields normalizing, those marginal regions then dip into the negative again and cash flow coming under strain once more. From a risk and probability perspective, we're now showing on screen these same three regions, so your marginal regions, your normal potential and your higher potential. And what you see in the green and red is the probability of generating a positive or a negative cash flow. So in 2021, based on the baseline projections, if we introduce historic uncertainty around that, in 57% of cases, the cash flow in these more marginal regions would be negative. This is then a big driver, this relative profitability in the area trends that we see over time, but it also, if you look historically from 2000, you'll see that this decline in white maize area is not exactly new. Over time, we've been able to grow productivity to the extent that we have been able to even grow production a little bit on a smaller and smaller area. So this relative profitability and export dynamics do influence this pattern, but also the relative demand for food and feed products. So despite the turnaround in per capita consumption of white maize, we do still foresee stronger demand from our livestock sectors, which are expanding. And so yellow maize and soybean area in particularly is expanding. But then something like sunflower, which is a mature market, a finely balanced market, we see area largely consolidating and trending sideways over the outlook. If one adds to that area then production volumes and also prices, you get the gross value of production for the various summer crops, and you see a very similar trend. So firstly, in 2020, you see a big rebound in revenue generated from these sectors. That shows remarkable resilience because from 2016 to 2019, the sector has actually had a very volatile period in terms of weather conditions, and profitability for many producers came under severe pressure. If you look forward, then you'll see that on average over the 10-year period, the white maize value is actually declining a little bit relative to the strong 2020 performance, but your feed-related crops, your yellow maize and your soybeans, that's expanding relative to what we saw in 2020. That brings us then to soybeans in particular, which is arguably one of the most dynamic sectors in South African agriculture over the past decade. We saw very rapid growth in area and production levels. In the last 2 years, that area has declined marginally. We have had some challenges with yield. In 2020, in particular, the eastern regions, which is where a lot of the soybean production takes place, have not had as favorable rainfall conditions as what we saw in the west. With the exchange rate support, prices have increased sharply, and so we expect a significant expansion in area from 2021 onwards. Over the course of the outlook, we do still foresee production growth, but at a rate that's much slower compared to the past decade. That has to do with, firstly, us expanding into more marginal production regions, which are not as ideal for soybeans as the regions that we're currently producing on, but also because the industry is maturing. So in history, where we saw a lot of expansion in our crushing capacity, our production is now starting to catch up. The utilization rates are becoming more sustainable, but the demand pull from the livestock sector is also slowing. What we have to note is that if we are to attain the production growth that we show in this slide and push prices towards export parity levels, we really will have to accelerate yield gains relative to the past decade, and that can be attained by factors such as the introduction of the breeding technology levy, but also specifically the right cultivar selection for specific production regions in South Africa. So if we turn to oilseed products, then we see also that the significant investment that occurred into the oilseed processing sector has allowed us to replace a substantial share of imported products in the past. The chart you see in front of you is for protein meal demand, disaggregated into the different production types locally and then also the imported oil cake. You'll see that from 2009 to 2019, a huge expansion in the dark blue bar, which reflects domestically produced soybean oil cake, replacing that which was previously imported. Over the outlook, we do expect this to continue, but generally the demand for protein meal is slowing, and that's based on the slower growth we talked about in the livestock sector. We also do expect us to replace further imports going forward, but the small volume of imports that remain essentially will come into the coastal regions, and if we want to supply that locally as well, we really will need to reduce the cost of our inland transportation. The other product, of course, coming out of the oilseed processing system is vegetable oil. Here we've seen historically that palm oil plays a big role, so that's one of our major imported products. That will always remain because South Africa doesn't produce palm oil. But if we look towards the other three, we see a very similar trend to the protein meal, where we've replaced a large share of imports with domestically produced soybean oil production in particular. And going forward, we project an expansion in both sunflower oil production and soybean oil production, and reducing that imported complement further. Quality is always an essential factor when it comes to processing and the competitiveness of processing. So what you see on screen is an extract from some work we've done related specifically to sunflower seed oil concentration. So on the chart it shows the oil concentration that was obtained from data in the national cultivar trials, and that's compared to the actual data that we see from silos. And you see that in the recent years there's been a real divergence there, with the cultivar trials yielding a higher oil content, but in silo actually getting a lower oil content. And of course this brings some pressure in terms of margins to your crushing industry. What's critical here then is cultivar selection again. So if in the table on the right we're comparing different cultivars, the first of which is available in South Africa and Argentina, but you can see the role of climate there. Over the same period, Argentina yielding a much higher quantity per hectare than what we saw in South Africa, and also yielding a higher oil content within that. The second bar then speaks to different cultivars in Argentina and South Africa, and there you can see that South Africa actually is able to close that gap a little bit with a different cultivar that's maybe more suited to our domestic production conditions. Another market where quality's made a significant difference is cotton. So if you look at the long-term view on cotton hectares, the stacked bar on the left-hand side, you'll see that cotton area in South Africa has been on a very long-term declining trend. Even in the early 90s, post-market deregulation, we see that we still produced more than 100,000 hectares of cotton in South Africa. That declined sharply in the period that followed, until very recently when we saw an uptick again in cotton production. Now that had a lot to do with relative profitability compared to other summer crops, but also improved technology, so improved marketing and also harvesting technology, which simply made the industry more competitive. A lot of the success has been built on exports. You'll see that since 2017, South Africa has become a net exporter of cotton lint. This goes predominantly to Asia. And again, it's a high quality product for which South Africa actually obtains a premium in the international market. Cotton is of course also a sector where small scale producers can thrive. So currently South Africa, around 70% of our area under cotton is attributed to small scale producers. But there is also scope to expand that. So what's encouraging is if you look at the area in 2017, 18, 19, when the industry came back and volumes increased again, we also saw an increase from smaller producers, firstly just in terms of the area produced by a similar number of producers. But in 2019 in particular, we also saw the number of producers increase quite significantly. Here we have a real opportunity to bring more producers into the sector, and that speaks specifically to the Makatini gin, which at the moment is estimated to only be operating at around 20% capacity. Much of that has to do with old technology, old machinery and infrastructure. And if we can replace this gin with a 20,000 ton capacity, more modern gin, we can add another 13,000 hectares. And this is important specifically for the region. Small scale producers can compete here, and it's also a region where sugarcane producers are actually coming under increasing pressure. So from that perspective, cotton actually presents a viable alternative for producers getting out of sugar. If we look towards sugar hectares in particular, then you'll see that over time we have lost a significant amount of hectares under sugarcane. There is some recovery in the short term, only a marginal recovery based on good yields and strong prices in recent years. But in the long term, we do still expect us to continue to that declining trend. And there's a number of factors that underpin that. The first is struggles to get productivity gains over time, much of which has to do with the climatic conditions in our sugar production regions. But secondly, also because we simply struggle to compete in the world market with low-cost producers, many of which obtain support in their country to produce then high volumes onto the global market, which in turn pushes prices down for South Africa. The third reason is one of our neighboring countries in Eswatini, which lost their duty-free access into the EU. As a result, they're pushing more product into South Africa under the duty-free SACU tariff agreement, which of course pushes more volumes into South Africa's market that we have to compete with, and labour generally in Eswatini would be cheaper than what it is in South Africa. The fourth was the recent introduction of the health promotions levy, which led to a lot of the beverage producers shifting away from sugar, formulating away from sugar towards alternatives that could be either healthy or simply more cost competitive, given that they have to pay that additional levy. The sugar industry is also one that's been working on a master plan. While this master plan is less aimed at additional growth, more aimed at a managed consolidation to increase efficiency in the industry, but also to make sure that farmers exiting sugarcane have viable alternatives in the region that they produce in. This does, however, come at a cost, as we've already seen 2 sugar mills close operations in 2020. If we move over to winter crops then, this speaks very specifically to areas in the Western Cape. Winter crops in general are much more constrained by resources. I think Fadi spoke earlier to some of the policy actions that have been taken to stabilize wheat area in particular. But the total production region in the winter rainfall regions is fairly stable going forward, and what we see inside that is increasing competition from the different products rather than a total expansion of the area under winter crops. In the short term, that's very much favorable to wheat, as we have a product like barley coming under increasing pressure due to the fact that the single buyer, which is AB InBev, was not able to malt for quite a long extended period through the lockdown action. This of course influences the relative risks for producers, and given that they do well in the wheat market at the moment at a weaker exchange rate, we do expect some shift into wheat. In the longer term, that does decline again as the continued shift into rotational systems leads to some expansion in barley area as well as also canola. The reality though is that the constraints in terms of production regions and resources results in the fact that South Africa always will remain a net importer of wheat products. Currently we import about half of our domestic consumption. That we expect to remain the case. So while area is fairly flat over the outlook, productivity gains do give us some production expansion. but the share of imports in the total market remains fairly constant. So that also implies that South Africa will continue to price wheat at import parity levels. Given that we apply the variable import tariff and that world prices remain below the price that triggers this tariff, it suggests that the major role player in terms of wheat price developments going forward is really the exchange rate. And so we see import parity levels and also the domestic wheat price following that trend quite closely. For barley and canola, South Africa is fairly self-sufficient, so it's a finely balanced market. In recent years, we've exported small quantities of barley, but over the outlook, we do expect to remain in a fairly self-sufficient position, with the price assumed to retain the link to wheat, therefore following a very similar trend to wheat. And then canola, of course, which competes for the same area, also follows a very similar price path to what we see in wheat. Canola is an interesting product because from a demand perspective, there's significant scope for expansion. It's well established now in the vegetable oil sector as a niche product in South Africa. From a protein meal perspective, it has a very unique market situation in that it has the opportunity to replace imported soybean oil cake in the Western Cape. That is expensive to move from our summer production regions, but canola cake can be utilized for dairy operations, particularly in the Western Cape. So far, production has not expanded to that same extent, mostly due to the fact that our yield levels are still low. So if you look on the chart, you'll see that South Africa's average yield levels don't compare very well to that we see in the rest of the world. But a small improvement in yield levels here will make the crop a lot more competitive compared to other winter crops. And there's also significant expansion potential for canola in the Eastern Cape if we can improve yield levels. To wrap up field crops then, we come to some critical factors again that speaks to accelerated and inclusive growth. Firstly, to note again that weather conditions in the western production regions have become increasingly difficult, so we see some shifts in cropping patterns. We also see producers including a bigger livestock component, that way diversifying their risk in the region. But if we want to get this region more sustainable, we really will need to look at something like crop insurance, which will only be viable if it is supported to some extent. We've highlighted the role of infrastructure and the cost of trade. So one of the key reasons why we remain a small net importer of protein meal, for instance, is because the cost of moving the product from the summer regions into the coastal regions is simply too high. And if we invest in rail infrastructure, we can reduce that quite significantly. The reality for this sector is that global prices are trending downwards, and they will likely continue to do so in future. And from that perspective, continued productivity gains, but also a focus on things like quality, sanitary and phytosanitary measures and consumer preferences around the world will make sure that South Africa is able to continue competing in this environment. So if we move on to the last subsector, then looking at horticulture products, if we remember right from the beginning, this is a sector that's done very well and expanded quite substantially over the past decade. But its long-term nature also implies that a lot of the area expansion that we have seen will only enter production over the outlook. So we're looking at a 10-year period where we'll see significant additional volumes entering the market. From our perspective, we need to make sure that we have competitive access to export markets for these volumes, but also that we have the infrastructure in place in terms of port capacity and specifically port efficiency so that we can move these products out across South Africa's borders. So on screen in front of you, you've got South Africa's total fruit and nut exports, disaggregated by country of destination. And what's evident is this is still fairly concentrated in the European Union, with almost 50% of South African products still destined for that market. But the one that we have managed to grow quite successfully and is also actively being targeted by the industry is the Asia-Pacific market, where demand is still growing globally and where we expect it to have more market space going forward. In terms of product mix, you'll see that if you pull out South Africa's top 15 export commodities within the agriculture and food products, very many of those are attributed to the horticultural sector. So the big one is citrus, which contributes the biggest share of South Africa's agricultural exports. That's followed by wine, also fresh and dried grapes and palm fruit, all of which make a significant contribution to South Africa's positive trade balance within agriculture. In terms of relative market importance, the share on the slide on screen gives you an indication of how important exports are within each specific commodity. And what's clear is that particularly within the bigger products on the left, with the products being sorted from left to right based on production volume, the exports are between 50 and 60, 75% of the volume within the market. If you were to express this in terms of value, exports would play a much bigger role still. So in most instances, the domestic fresh market is quite a small component, and the growth and the success that we've seen within this horticultural sector has very much been attributed to the growth evident in export markets. What is important to remember, however, is that even though we've underpinned the growth strategy by export volumes, you also will grow, if you grow export volumes, you also will end up producing more fruit also for the local market and the processing sector. So we will also increase the volume of fruit coming into our domestic marketing channels. One of the key aspects that supports our competitiveness with respect to horticulture is also seasonality, and the fact that we're counter-seasonal to the Northern Hemisphere, where a lot of our product is exported to. With that respect, if one thinks about something like COVID-19 and the lockdown actions which influenced it over the past few months, you really need to look at which relevant products were in the market then. Unfortunately or fortunately for us, the biggest exporter was in the market at that time. So we really saw good coordinated efforts across the industry to make sure that our citrus products could still be exported. We had a very big crop, and we managed to move volumes through the harbours despite many challenges, which is part of the success that we've seen within South African agriculture in 2020. What that also implies is that going forward, we need to think about things like port capacity. It has a challenge that has come up through COVID and the lockdown action, but it's not new. It was already a challenge in 2019 when it influenced citrus export volumes in particular. So what you've got on screen is the 3 major port regions in South Africa and the fruit mix that would typically be exported from them. So in 2019, South Africa moved a staggering 261 million export cartons through our ports. 37% of that went through Durban Harbour, which is quite concentrated in terms of citrus and avocados, both of which are in the market at the same time. So this would imply that you can easily end up with a congested situation through the months that those products move out. The Eastern Cape is smaller, around 16%, and a lot of that is attributed to citrus, but also with some palm fruit. And then the Western Cape, where almost 47% of our volumes move out, is a much more diversified product mix, with palm fruit being the biggest contributor, followed by grapes and citrus. If one looks towards the future, however, the reality is that by 2029, our projections indicate that we'll have to increase those volumes that move through these ports by 40% to reach 367 million cartons exported. And given that we're already challenged in some months with volumes and congestion in some of our harbours, this is a very important aspect that we need to remember and need to make sure that we're able to get to in 10 years' time. That speaks very specifically then to the expansion that we have seen in the industry. So stacked on the chart in front of you, you've got a view to the major fruit types in South Africa and the expansion over time. So in terms of hectares, if you combine palm fruit, stone fruit, citrus, table grapes, avocados and macadamia nuts, we've seen an area expansion over the past decade of 47%. Given the delay in production, the fact that many of these long-term crops take multiple years to enter production, a lot of that expansion will only become evident over the outlook period, and there we see production volumes expanding by 33% over the next 10 years. What that implies for export volumes, we've got on screen now just a view to seasonality with citrus. What it shows is a 3-year average in terms of the blue line of export volumes within specific weeks from South Africa. It overlays that also with the year-to-date exports for 2020, where we've done fairly well, but then places on top of that 2029. And there you can see that for total citrus, we have to expand this volume by 46% over the next 10 years. So one can't overemphasize in this regard the criticalness of efficient ports and getting product moved through those ports efficiently. A lot of the commodities where we see more expansion over the outlook are some of the smaller ones, something like avocados. These commodities are less mature, specifically also in the global market. Avocados being classified as a superfruit and macadamia nuts. These are newer products, so it's products where we still see or foresee per capita gains in consumption in the global market. So there's arguably more space to grow our markets in these. For avocados, we still expect an expansion of almost 80% over the next 10-year period. And for macadamias, that's a little bit lower at 70%. Critical, though, is that, again, these products take a long time to enter production. Macadamias only reach full bearing after 10-12 years. Avocados take 7 to 8 years. So some of the volume that we see in that area expansion over the next 10 years will actually also only enter production in the period that follows that. Macadamias in particular, as we've said, all these horticultural commodities are long-term views, but macadamias, that's particularly true. So what we're showing on screen is just a breakdown of the costs associated with establishing macadamias, and then we compare that to the income generated, given that we take 12 years to get to full bearing age. What that implies is that from establishment, we stay in a negative position in terms of profitability, and we only break even in year 11. Now, this is important because a lot of producers have made a really long-term commitment in expanding area here, but it's also important because if we think of something like inclusivity and transformation, it implies that it's a really long period that you need to support producers for if you want to bring them into this industry sustainably and allow them to generate an income from this industry. Given the long-term nature of this investment, we really need to come to the party in terms of market access. So we noted earlier that a lot of the growth in exports will likely come from the Asian region going forward, where we see demand for fruit products still increasing. On the table that you see on screen, we've compared South Africa's tariff situation relative to our major competitors in these Asian markets. Essentially what it means that any green block, there's a preferential tariff agreement in place between the exporter and the importer. And if you look at South Africa, we only really have that preferential agreement in India, whereas our competitors have trade agreements all over the show, which allows them to access these markets more competitively, where South Africa would be subject to the most favored nation tariff, which is then higher than what our competitors face in these markets. Despite that, South Africa has grown its share in the global market for fruit. So what you see on screen is the total global volume in the bars being exported of very specific fruit types, disaggregated into total full year, so in a complete calendar year, and also then in light blue, the share being exported in the time when South Africa is in the market. So South Africa has increased its share in orange exports, for instance, to 20% of the global market, but if one looks only at the period where our citrus is actually moving out of the country, that share is as high as 40%. Macadamia nuts, we're also at 40% already, and what this implies is that if we push additional volumes into these markets over the next 10 years, we are likely also to influence global prices. In citrus, that's particularly evident if one looks to the price projection. So in the past, you see on screen the nominal prices and the real prices where we've accounted for inflation. And over the past decade, we've actually seen a substantial increase, at least to 2016, in real prices, which is in part what's underpinned the success that we've seen in this sector. Over the past few years, as those additional volumes enter the market, we have seen those prices of lemons and limes and citrus and soft citrus in particular declining. And over the course of the outlook period, we do see real prices declining quite significantly as a result of these additional volumes coming into the market. The result of that then also spills into our area projections. So if you look at citrus in particular, you'll see that following this period of rapid growth, we actually see a flattening of area growth over the outlook period, so quite a significant slowdown in area expansion. And this is also true for some of our other major commodities. Something like table grapes has also grown rapidly in the past. In recent years, it's become increasingly challenged in terms of competing with South American competition in particular. Think of a country like Peru. So going forward, we do see some consolidation. We see a slowdown in area growth as we focus more on quality and less on quantity, to make sure that we compete effectively with those South American products. The other side of that is that for something like table grapes, which is predominantly produced in the Western Cape, there's also a limit as to how much you can expand area in terms of resource potential and how much area we have that's suitable for table grape production. The other sector, which is also fairly concentrated in the Western Cape in terms of production regions and therefore also constrained in terms of resources, is palm fruit. So on screen, you've got the outlook for exports in terms of tons and in terms of value for apples and for pears. And there you can see again that where we have apples expanding, so apples have the benefit, of course, that under controlled atmosphere storage, you can store most varieties for a full year period. So that broadens your market access window. It also makes the product more able to export into Africa, for instance, where it can deal better with the challenges in terms of infrastructure and time taken on the road. So this is a market that's grown quite considerably for South Africa. A lot more products being directed into Africa over the past decade, and specifically with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement coming up, it's also a market where we see quite substantial growth in the future. On the pear side, that expansion is then more limited, obviously competing for the same resources, and therefore you see a lot of producers increasing the share of apples in their total pome fruit production component relative to pears. Apart from that, one also has to consider risk and uncertainty. So here we come to plums, and what we show on screen is again the result of a risk analysis. So what we've done is we've looked at historic volatility in terms of yield levels, pack-out percentages for exports, and then export and domestic prices. And if we apply that to the plum industry in particular, we see really a very broad band between the top end and the bottom end of the outcomes. And what this would be indicative of is that there's a huge risk factor within these markets. So fruits in general is a very long-term sector. It's a big investment. It can do very well. There's a lot of opportunity to make good profits, but things also have to go very right for that to happen. And there's also a big downside in terms of risk. So from that perspective, it's really a difficult industry if you think about transformation and introducing new players into this industry. And one really then has to think carefully about the support structures that you provide when you want to bring new players into the sector. The other one that's also been competing very strongly for resources, and a sector where we've seen some significant consolidation in the past, is wine. So if one looks at the number of vines in production in South Africa over the past decade, that's declined by around 13%. Much of that has to do with the relative competitiveness to fruit. We have lost a fair amount of wine area to products such as soft citrus, which was simply more profitable given the real increase in prices at a time when real wine prices were actually declining. The sector has been through this period and was sort of starting to stabilize, with producers starting to reinvest towards the end of last year. 2020 was shaping up to be a good year, but then of course COVID-19 struck, and the wine industry from that perspective has been one of the most severely impacted by that situation, predominantly because of the trade restrictions that occurred firstly for exports and secondly then into South Africa's domestic market. So if one considers the market balance for wine historically, we see that from 2009 to 2013 we had rapid growth in the industry, in fact more so than what the market was able to take up in terms of exports and domestically. The industry then went through its strategic exercise, and what followed was a period of consolidation where they really rebalanced supply and demand. Production volumes declined. The industry made a very conscientious shift towards value, reorientating the market towards that. And made significant progress until 2020 came along, of course, and from that perspective, the trade restrictions imposed has really put the industry back a far way. So if you see at stocks, for instance, in the grey bar, the extent to which stocks have run up again in a short time due to the fact that the industry couldn't trade for several months. It's also important to note that it takes, within this lower economic growth environment, it takes us a long time to work these stocks out of the market again. For that reason, we still see some reduction in the short term, with production only stabilizing over the second half of the outlook period. So to wrap up horticulture, the critical factors to accelerate growth, in addition of course to supporting our domestic wine industry, is the substantial volumes that will be entering the market. We know they're coming. A lot of the area has already been established, and a lot of the area will still be established in the next few years. But we need to make sure that we have competitive market access for these products. A lot of it will be exported, and we need to make sure that our ports are efficient in moving these volumes out. We also need to make sure that we can compete efficiently in international markets. We are facing increasing competition from South America in particular, and we need to make sure that our quality is on par to be able to compete with those producers. In terms of our target market, a lot of the product moves to developed regions where your consumer has preferences in addition to the economic ones, so things like quality and consistency, and also sustainability in terms of things like packing material become increasingly important. Lastly, the long-term nature of the industry and the sheer size of the investment required to enter it also implies that we really need a long-term and a patient support structure if we are to bring new entrants into this market. So we've gone through a lot of slides, we've covered the baseline outlook in a lot of detail, but I want to just take a step back then and bring you back to the topic of the presentation and what Fadi spoke about earlier, is that we really shouldn't be aiming for the baseline. We should be aiming to accelerate the growth that we see in the baseline, which really reflects a business as usual scenario. And we know that business as usual won't be good enough going into the future. So to finish us off, I just want to draw your attention back to the slide which also presented the end of Fadi's presentation earlier, just underlining the preconditions, the 4 pillars essentially on which we feel accelerated growth in the sector can be achieved. The first of those is investment and the general security around the investment environment. The second is support and innovation, which speaks to finance, policy support, the general comprehensive support system required for our agricultural producers. The third is infrastructure, which speaks very much to reducing the cost of transportation, but also ensuring efficiency through our ports for a lot of sectors that are basing the growth strategy on exported products. And the last, of course, is markets, which speaks to increased market access, broader market access, but also more competitive market access, and also the general environment of plant and animal health that we need to achieve in order to make sure we can access these markets. All of that then comes back and needs to be underpinned by an efficient and coordinated institutions and departments which are able to implement these strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for that marathon presentation. That was really more detailed, and as you delve deeper, there was more insight coming from what you have presented. I imagine that a number of people, particularly those who are involved in some of the sectors that you have covered, be it from consumption, the input side, as well as the market, both international and local, they have got information that they need. But if they need to know more and they also wish to engage further, we have a panel discussion that will follow later. But now I want to go back to Fadi to give a brief presentation about how really can we accelerate inclusive growth, particularly looking at a perspective of an industry such as beef, and see how that would really assist with the growth in the sector as well as in the economy. Fadi, please.
Today we've heard a lot about value chains, we've heard about the outlook for various sectors, and what we want to briefly illustrate in this session is an approach that we're currently doing in collaboration with the National Agricultural Marketing Council, the Department of Agriculture, and the University of Johannesburg. And it's a research consortium where we're supporting the agriculture and agro processing master plan process. In this approach, we're essentially picking each value chain. In the example that we have here today, it's beef. Why do we pick beef? Because it's really a sector where we have about 41% of the total herd sitting in the informal sector. In other words, a huge opportunity for grown productivity, for investment, and really increasing the black farmer share in the total output of our industry. This sector, as it currently stands, already represents about 12% of the agriculture gross value of production, and it further has switched from being a net importer about 10 years ago or less to a net exporting industry where we're currently to the value of about 10.9 billion rand. So the question is, can we introduce very specific interventions to boost the productivity of this industry and at the same time also grow market access in the export market? The market-led approach specifically looks at these opportunities. It looks at competitiveness, it looks at market access, it looks at private sector investment, it looks at public sector investments in a specific node of the value chain. So, and then at the end of the day, we need to prioritize, because the reality is we cannot afford everything. So we need to be sure what are the policy prioritization activities or the investments, whether it's policy levers or whether it's public or private sector investments that need to be introduced in a value chain to let it grow in a more ideal state. In this diagram, what we're actually showing is the value chain at various nodes. From the right-hand side, we've got the markets, we've got household markets, we've got the retail sector, we've got the export industry, and if we link it then back into processing, we understand who are the stakeholders at the processing node. The production side, we can see we've got commercial producers, we've got large scale and medium size, we've got subsistence producers, and then obviously the feedlots feeding straight into the processing sector and also into export, but also into our local market. So through this process, and this is just as an illustration, these are proposed interventions. A big contribution, or really an intervention that could grow the output of the industry, is herd productivity. In terms of specific genetics, producer support systems. We're looking at herd health, overall vaccination programs. Again, veterinary services, more efficiency in terms of on the ground, reaching out to producers that are in possession of livestock. On the export level side, if you look at the bottom right hand side of the corner, and the shading actually illustrates who are the partners. Clearly this shows a blue and a red section, and that refers to government and private sector. So who's going to do what in these interventions? Where we have market access, it needs to be a partnership between the public sector and the private sector, working together to understand what are the markets where we have the opportunity to grow. Joint funding initiatives for transformation. This is where we typically look at blended financing models within a value chain. In other words, if we can have a catalyst at a certain node in the value chain, that already unlocks value chain financing principles. So you can actually lock in equity within a value chain through contracting. Let's take a practical example. If we have an offtake agreement of a retailer or of a large feedlot, linking a smallholder into that contract, there's already much more certainty in terms of financing for a bank. So these are the type of blended financing models that could really make a difference in the productivity gains or market access that we have in a big section of this herd. Another one, SPS compliances, and this is really again where commercial value chains have to play a role. These are compliances and barriers to entries that are very high, that are expensive, and you need critical scale. So how do you link a smallholder or an informal sector into a value chain through aggregation, where you can actually deliver into these high-end markets that have very high barriers of entry? And we need traceability and identification system for this. And this has currently been a drive in the industry, being led by private sector and government working together. And it's really a system that's been coming for many years, and a plan. We've seen many plans in these, but we need the implementation of the system to drive traceability and to drive the identification of the total herd. Lastly, meat grading. Again, many proposals on the table. The importance of the grading system links directly in the type of markets that we are feeding into, and the question is our grading system actually the correct system for the local market and for the international market to feed into? Lastly, if we introduce these specific interventions at each node, we actually can get to an impact. What could the potential impact be? And this is really where we get to the cost-benefit analysis and leading back to the principle of prioritization. If we can pull the correct levers, and yes, some of these interventions will cost money. If we think about the traceability or identification and traceability system, the principle of compartmentalization, it will cost money. But at the end of the day, if we can look at potential growth in the industry, we can easily grow our sector from current export share of production of around about 5% to 24%. Our total production can increase by about 35% over the baseline. This could create another 8.2 billion rand in gross value of production. It can generate another 3,200 jobs. We can have about 200,000 additional weaner calves coming from the lower end of the supply chain, where we currently have a low level of productivity, making them more productive, intensifying the production system, and actually harvesting a bigger calf crop from the current herd. These are principles that are currently being debated and researched in the Agriculture Master Plan for each value chain, and we're certainly looking forward to a lot more of these interventions and potential impacts that can be analyzed.
Thank you, Ferdy, for agreeing to stick within such a brief period, but at the same time providing a very useful and insightful information about how to accelerate growth. And it is very important that you did highlight the fact that, this growth that we're talking about going forward is not only aspirational, but it can be achieved. Those targets can be reached provided we have the public, private, as well as community working together towards that. So that is very helpful, and we'll come back to that in the discussion later on. But something that I think all participants have observed so far, although it is not new to Bfap presentations, is the fact that this information is loaded with data, with evidence, as well as facts that we gather from the industry, government, and other partners that we work with. But this information is also not without challenges, and therefore I would like to invite Marian, who is our data science specialist, to discuss some of the few things that we come across in as far as data is concerned, and how do we need to address that going forward together with our partners. Marian, please go ahead.
Thank you, Matlo. I'll be talking about data in South Africa's agricultural sector. In South Africa, we have very good data. I think we're sometimes a little bit spoiled, and we also have a lot of success stories. One of the success stories I want to kick off with is the Crop Estimates Committee, as well as the Supply and Demand Estimates Committee. They are frequently supplying accurate and timely data into the market that helps the market make decisions and oftentimes influences pricing to a great deal. The value of data lies in its accurateness and its timeliness, and the way it enables us to make decisions as policymakers and as business people. In this presentation, I'll be pointing out some gaps in terms of the data in South Africa, the data availability, and what we're able to do with it and what not. And I've got one nice example where I share what we can do with the data when it is available. In terms of decision making, the GDP is probably one of the most well-known economic indicators whereby economies are measured, and as well as the agricultural economy's contribution to the South Africa's economy is also measured. On the left-hand side, you'll see the green line depicts the production accounts published by the Agricultural Department. The blue line depicts the Stats SA official estimate that is published. And then the grey line are our own estimates where we compare the GDP number to these other lines. Now already you can see these are all lines trying to estimate gross domestic product generated by the agricultural sector, and we've got just different trends going over time. Another way to show this discrepancy or the differences is to look at 1 year. On the right hand side we've got the gross farm income in 2017, and if we assume the census of commercial agriculture is the most recent and up-to-date number, then the gross farm income, comparing that to other sources, we are underestimating that by up to 21% from other sources. That amounts to 50 to 70 billion rand. So the discrepancy can be quite large. Another point I want to raise is the point of quantifying land use. So here we are comparing again the census of commercial agriculture in 2017 with the flyover data that was also done in 2017 in the Western Cape. And we see in some crops we see differences of up to more than 100% in terms of the area planted. Another example in terms of land use where we have the data is in Limpopo, where the flyover was done in 2012. And by their estimate, by SIQ's estimate, we were underestimating some of the crops in Limpopo, the value added, we were underestimating it by up to 11 billion rand, which is also quite a significant underestimation or pointing to underestimation. Given those differences, I want to move to another Stats SA source that we're frequently using and that adds a lot of value to our consumer economics division. It's the income and expenditure data. So since 25, the new master sample has been implemented, and before that we cannot compare the data, but after that This is one of the very few data sets that helps us track expenditure data over time and analyze it over time. Primarily, the IES is used for the weighting in the inflation basket, and recently in 2014-15, the budget constraints from StatSA caused the IES to be downscaled and combined with the living conditions survey. So we're reducing the number of points and data we're capturing. Most recently in 2019-20, the budget cuts again influenced a cut in data coming in. So that IES that was supposed to be running this year or last year was also cut. Now, budget cuts is something that the international community is facing, and other governments are also being creative around where to get data from. We've got an article from the Wall Street Journal where the American government is looking towards big data and big data technologies to gather some of the information points covered in the IES. Now, I think StatSA is not far behind. They've been using price scraping tools in the lockdown time when retail prices weren't available. We couldn't go out and get them, and so StatSA innovated in that way. And I think to turn towards these cost-effective ways will open up some budget to capture more important or missing data points that we're not currently covering. Talking about not covering some of the data points, part of the economy that is not represented in a lot of these surveys, especially also the income and expenditure survey, trying to monitor the expenditure on food, is the rural economy. Now, this map you've seen before in Fadi's presentation. The colors indicate the percentage of poor households in each local municipality, and the circles indicate the share of the agriculturally active households. And we see that in these rural economies, the own production of food does contribute significantly towards food consumption. And that is something that has been captured by the KwaZulu-Natal Goat Agribusiness Project. They've been doing in the kind of northeastern parts of KwaZulu-Natal, they've been doing livestock censuses over the past 4 years. And we analyzed that data and incorporated it to compare, if we had the data, what could we do with it? And that's what takes me to this graph here. On the left-hand side, the left-hand bar, we have a proxy for per capita meat intake that is calculated from the income and expenditure survey, and that is compared with the dotted line at the top that depicts the South African food-based dietary guideline, as it's the recommended intake. And for the low-income households, based on the IES data, we see that those typical households would consume 57% less than the dietary guideline, which is quite a significant gap. But we're not taking into consideration the own production of food. So on the right-hand side, we used this data that was captured by the Goat Agribusiness Project and added that own consumption, so the livestock used by that household, to their typical, the per capita estimate. And that brings this gap between the ideal intake and the estimated intake down to 25%. So that's quite a big difference. And I think this is just one example that goes to show what we are missing in terms of our national statistics. In terms of key recommendations, I've got a summary for each of the points mentioned. One of the key recommendations is to establish a committee together with Agricultural Department and StatSA to accurately quantify those GDP numbers and to get a bit more transparency into that system. A more regular IES, and also focusing on cost-effective ways to gather some of the data points that are covered in the IES, the Income and Expenditure Survey, will go a long way to getting us towards capturing the economy as a whole. In terms of our national aerial census and land audits, a periodic land census in South Africa, a complete census, would help us to rebase our statistics, to sense check our statistics, and also to pick up those productivity gains that we're having going from one period to the next, say a 5-year period or a 4-year period. And it would also help us track our resource utilization. In terms of the livestock herd, we've got good estimates from StatSA 2016, but they're almost already outdated, and we need to regularly get a good handle on how big our livestock herd is. That's a lot of capital walking around. And in terms of accessibility of data, with the data technologies and new big data technologies we have at hand, there's really no excuse not to make data available while still protecting its integrity. From the Bfap data science team, we're always looking forward to more collaboration, always more data. There is always more data, and we really like getting the insights out of that, and we're looking forward to more collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marion, for that presentation. I think by now all participants and people who joined us, they are now familiar or have an insight into the kind of challenges that we come across when we're dealing with this data. And the importance of data, I think no one can underplay it now. Just having seen how much information was shared in the last 2 hours or so. And therefore, going forward, we hope that our partners, our stakeholders, even the public in general, will be keen to share this information, will be keen to provide resources to make information available, having seen the wealth and the worth of the information. However, having promised that we will later on have a panel, I am now joined by a number of panelists in the studio. But I'll first start by introducing the two gentlemen whom you haven't met or heard their voices yet. I have Mr. Mokeza Ramasodi, the Director General from the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. Ndadi, kiagamagala studio.
Thank you very much. It's Deputy Director General. At least I'm accused of taking and annexing DG's post.
Yes, Deputy Director General. Sorry for that mistake. Thank you so much. And we are also joined by the Chief Economist from Agbase, who is known all over the country, if not all over the world. A renowned author of wonderful books, but today we are here on Bfap Business, Wandile Sihlobo. Wandile, welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Maybe let me just start with you. Having seen this presentation, and now that we are joined by the two presenters, Ferdy on your left, and then to your right you have Tracy. They have made presentations and you have watched some of those. What is your impression from the perspective of the sector, or your own perspective as well?
Yeah, I think generally, firstly, I think it's important to acknowledge that what Bfap is doing is really a great service to the country, because this is information that then gets to be publicly available out there. And my key impression, really, by looking at what has been discussed here, firstly, it's around a confirmation or reaffirming what we have been seeing, that agriculture at a broad level, we have been able to withstand some of the challenges that have been brought by the pandemic. Obviously also highlighting some of the sectors that did get to find some bit of a glitches in there. I was also more surprised by that when you look at their GDP for agriculture numbers, 13%, that's really good in an economy that will be contracting by more than 7% or so. On our side, we had thought that the number could be somewhere about 10% or so. That's good. But I think at a more fundamental pace for me, it's also around elevating agriculture in the public discussion at a point where we are also in a policy side saying, in terms of jobs, in terms of growth, what should be done where. And I think Bfap zooming down to some of the key preconditions that have come out for development, for growth and job creation in agriculture, that's one of the key important things. And I think that if we are to make progress, we really need to go into those preconditions, prioritize and saying which one should be done with. So generally, I think it's really a useful document.
Okay, thank you so much. And progress is exactly what we need going forward, because we are in a very difficult as well as different time of our lives. But to you, Mokeza, I'll ask you the same question about basically your impression as well. I know that year after year, we have representatives from your department, not one, not two, but more than 10, attending the traditional Bfap launch. So, but this is a different year. So I get an opportunity to ask you your impression of this year's baseline launch.
Oh, thank you very much for that question. I think let me start by congratulating Bfap for yet another good deposition in terms of the agricultural industry. It's very important that we also recognize the work that is being done by your good selves, the partners that you have, and the board in general in terms of Bfap. What you have done this year, I think, in a year where we are experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, is to paint a very good picture in terms of how agriculture can be a sector that can lead this economy out of the recession. Very important in terms of now the outlines that we are having and the projections that we are having, that as government, with the deep dives that Bfap has done, we come up with a policy space that would enhance agricultural production in different sectors through the district development model, to ensure that as a country we are able to show at household level, at national level, we have got food security and we are able to create jobs that are needed within the sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And you really put your finger on it when you describe the positive picture, but as well as also the challenges that Wandile has mentioned. But we'll look into some of those as we get deeper into the discussion. Ferdy, just to put you on the spot, you have done this 17 times, but this year was the first time when you looked around, there were no audience. You couldn't see someone panicking, you couldn't see someone nodding, so it might have been a different experience. Do you mind just sharing that experience of presenting to a different set of audience or from a different position than the last 16 years?
Yeah, so thanks, Matlo. I think the biggest change was, and really this was it's a fantastic team thinking about what are the opportunities in a situation that was actually bad for us. We really look forward to a baseline where we can meet and greet and we can see our partners and we can see our colleagues and really engage in a personal way. And I think this is a very common challenge for everyone who does a conference or some kind of an event where you really want to engage with people. And we sat down and we said, what's the opportunity out of all of this? And really to go to ensure that we actually have far bigger reach of this event was the benefit. And looking at those numbers as people were logging in, and you could see here are 500 people logged in listening, and you at least know a lot of them, you're familiarized with their faces. We looked at the comments coming in, and I think it's been a good experience for us. And going forward, it might be a combination, who knows? But we're also looking forward to comments. We're grateful to have it in such a way. We definitely miss our people, but the reach to go global and to have regional impact and to have really just a broader base of people logging in. It's been a great experience.
All right. Thank you. I think you have just turned, that's what you said, or that's what I take from your discussion, that you turned a situation that was negative largely into a positive, saying that we had an audience of 500 people. In the past, we are limited by venue and participants are limited by traffic and other commitments, but we managed to use that opportunity to reach as many people as possible, to reach people all over the world. And therefore, out of every situation, you can find a positive outcome, and we'll see how agriculture does that. But now I want to turn to Tracy. You had a marathon presentation, presenting a lot of details, but also not just details, looking forward, which is usually, if not always, a very difficult thing to do because you don't know what tomorrow holds. And the presentation of an outlook is grounded as well as anchored by a set of assumptions. But the common assumption that we normally include is the fact that we expect the future to be normal or to be similar to the past. We assume that there aren't extreme, conditions. However, this was not a normal year, all right? So just how was the preparation of the outlook? I know that behind you there's a team, but you are the face of the team at this moment. How was just this presentation of the future in the current climate looking like? But how does this also take us to that future that we want? Do you want to share a little bit around that? Because it's not an easy task, I can tell you that.
Thank you, Matlo. Yeah, so we always, I mean, for the baseline, we always need to put the disclaimer that it's one possible outcome, right? So it's based on a set of assumptions that we feel is a plausible outcome. And of course, the nice thing of it is that there's an analytical system behind it. So yes, you do have to make some assumptions. And yes, this year, those assumptions were a lot more uncertain than what they would normally be. That certainly has made our life maybe a little bit more difficult, but I think it's also given us a great opportunity. So essentially what the baseline does is it considers the fundamentals that underpin the sector and gives you a view on the direction in which the sector is going. But from that, it actually really just presents the starting point. So now when you have the system underpinning it, you can now start with further analysis. You can look at different scenarios. You can see how these assumptions might change, how things might play out. As we get bits more of information, we can utilize that and feed that into the system and see how this outlook might change, how the view might change. So in that sense, it gives us a firm starting point for further analysis, but it also gives us a lot of opportunities to evaluate different outcomes and how one might respond to the situation as it unfolds.
Thank you, and I agree that at the same time, I think there was also an opportunity to learn, because the event we're talking about here hasn't happened in the last 100 years. So in other words, we're dealing with a situation that no one or most of us alive today have never seen. And therefore we had to work through that. And here we had a wonderful presentations today. But now that I have a panel and I've asked for participants to send questions, I've received a number of questions, just maybe to go back to the participants that, the panel will discuss some of the questions, but others will be responded through the platform or other means through which Bfap communicates. So I just want to go to the first question that I have received. It comes from Johan van Rooyen, and if I'm not mistaken, is Prof. Johan van Rooyen. He's asking, and any one of you can just go first, tackle this question, that why do we support, promote, or sustain uncompetitive enterprises? Is that the best benefit or the best use of resources? Or, to frame it slightly different, just to extend it, he's also asking, since we mentioned support a lot of time, what do you do when you have a sector or an industry that is not responsive to the support or to some incentives that are out there? Is that question clear? But I think it's a very important question, because the word support came quite a number of times throughout the presentation. Fedi, do you want to go first, maybe, in addressing Johan's question?
Yeah, thanks, Matlo. I'll give it a go, and then you must also. So I think one point that Johan is referring to is we mentioned policy support, and we talked about the wheat industry. So we had a big decline. If you really look at the history of the wheat industry, we've had 1 million hectares decline, basically disappearing in the Free State. And partly climatic, but also a lot of support coming in those days from the wheat board. And those hectares did not disappear. They basically, depending on the remote sensing work and the type of analyses, it's about 600,000 hectares that remained in field crops, and the other 400 went back into pasture. So something is happening there. There are changes, and the question is, can we support industries? There are pockets where it makes sense, but it's not only a blunt instrument of piling on tariffs. We should not do that. We should see it in a package of what the wheat industry is doing in terms of breeding, in terms of grading system, quality, and similar type of exercises we can run for other industries. So there are definitely, in terms of support, there are industries where we can grow more in terms of exports if we can support and unlock idle resources. And I think that's what it's all about, is unlocking idle resources where we have already capital flowing in, but we're not making the connections yet. And this is where this idea of value chains comes in, where you have a working together between public and private sector, and you need a catalyst at the right spot. And a lot of time that catalyst, we miss it. And that's, I think, where we can unlock a number of idle potential that's still sitting in the industry.
If maybe I may just a little bit to add onto Fedi's point. But I think if we look at agriculture, a type of support that we've really been getting at a large space is really on a trade policy side. It's not that there's been active capital that is coming into a large proportion. But I think onto that, we have to think back to the point that Freddie is raising. You think about the poultry sector, for example. What is the key issue? Is it on the feed side, or is it, and then I think we need to be thoughtful about the instruments that we are using for that support. And also then just going on the ground level of saying, do we really have a comparative advantage to this industry, or should we be doing other things on the side? But I think for these two industries that we have mentioned, we can thrive, but we just need to know what type of a support do we offer.
Maybe to latch on the points that have been made by Fedi and Wandi. And I'm happy that he raises the issue around the wheat industry and the history that comes with it, because most of the data that you see people projecting would be the data coming from almost 1996 onwards. This is very important in terms of the lost 1 million hectares. But it's very important then to change the question into an answer, to say, what do we do going forward in terms of determining which of these sectors can be competitive and can be supported. And that is where the government perspective in terms of the agriculture and agro processing master plan comes in, because you start identifying through the deep dives that have been done by a Bfap, by NAMAC, to say which are those industries that we can support, that are competitive, that have got competitive advantage and comparative advantages, and we move ahead from that side. And just to highlight, we have identified 8 up to this stage, and we think that those are the winners that we will start supporting going forward. And that would also set aside the question that Prof had asked around why are we supporting those that are uncompetitive.
And I think just to extend to your points is that if we look at some of the presentations, the fastest growing, when a breakdown of the industries, you see that the fastest growing are the ones that are export oriented. They're looking outside and they compete at that level. And therefore your point precisely to say that when you identify them like that and support them to reach that level of competitiveness, then they can shoot forward. Okay, I have received a number of questions and I just combined them into one. And right now, and 3 people, but I'll just present a combined question from the 3 participants, are based on the presentations that were made. In that, and one day you made that point that agriculture is growing in a very difficult period, about 13%. And therefore the question generally it says, is this growth or this overall performance based on the opportunity that we see because agriculture is an essential sector, and therefore it had to operate during the pandemic, or is it just the resilience? Is it opportunistic, or is it the resilience of the sector? Maybe let me start with you, Tracy, because they are asking this on the basis of the numbers that you presented.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think there's multiple aspects to that. So firstly, I would say agriculture is a very resilient sector. I think we've seen that. If you look past the past 5 years, if you look at the drought we had in 2016, many of the factors that Fadi mentioned, animal disease, listeria, weather, it's been a really difficult period the last few years in terms of weather. So it's been exceptionally volatile. But yet we see every time that when we have a good year in terms of weather, the sector really bounces back strongly. At the same time, there has been aspects such as the exchange rate depreciation, which as a primary sector has helped it to be strong here. But the fact that we still operated through the lockdown as an essential service, the fact that the sector worked very well together also with government to make sure that things remained functional. If I think of a product like citrus, the lockdown, that's an industry where production levels have increased based on investment that have been made over the past 5 years. So it's an industry that has reinvested, it has built for the future. Now it had this big crop coming in, it had the lockdown imposed and right at the time where the crop needs to start moving out. And there was a lot of good cooperation between the sector with government to make sure that everything keeps functioning, to make sure that we can get the product out of ports. So it did benefit from the weak rand, but had we not taken those other actions, it wouldn't have been allowed to either. So I think there's good aspects of multiple fronts.
Okay, so there's a bit of both. Anyone wants to add to Tracy's point on this?
I think Tracy has got it right. If you look what happened just at the beginning of the lockdown, government together with industry and Bfap came together to come up with a value chain tracker for the sector. And it was easier to identify those areas where you have got gaps, areas where you have got bottlenecks, and you could go as government to go and untie those or unbottle those. So it's very important in terms of the sector that that cooperation at that level needs to be harnessed and be carried forward. And to this effect, I think some of the issues that we now need to look forward to is how do we enhance that cooperation? How do we enhance the tracker to be something that can be used industry-wide to ensure that these issues where you have got bottlenecks and you don't have that cooperation are dealt with simultaneously to increase the efficiencies within our systems.
Okay. And
I think maybe the one thing that's interesting, and Wandile, you can also help here. It's the what we're picking up if we look back. It's really the industries. We presented these preconditions, and the elements around investment, around market access, around infrastructure, around support. And if we look at if you just dissect these value chains and the performance that we've seen. Those elements are in there. You can see it. Tracy talked about market access in citrus, working together and getting those markets open. And by the way, there's a lot more volume coming, so we need to be ready. And the ports, Tracy, if we look at the numbers, about 40% increased capacity that we need in the next 10 years. So we know if we need to prioritize in terms of infrastructure investment, we know the volumes are underway. We've expanded irrigation hectares by 70,000 hectares since the NDP. That's a lot of volume of fruits and high-value products that are going to come through our ports, and we need to invest in those. So those are kind of preconditions. But in this lockdown period, we saw the value of efficient operations in terms of logistics. In terms of market information, just imagine, Wandile, you also wrote a lot in March, and we were all projecting saying, don't panic. There is sufficient food and there is sufficient value chains that can deliver this food. And this panic buying, yes, there was panic buying, but the fact that we have a crop estimates committee, we have a S&D committee that NMC is chairing, that we had this vision of what does the food balance sheet look like. I'm not saying by that the impact on low-income vulnerable households is severe, and we know that, and the job losses are severe. But at least to ensure that we have cost-effective food in the system was a big plus, and it's based on these preconditions.
Yeah. If I may just add a brief bite on that. I would say, yes, we are growing, but it's not only just the fact that we were left alone, as Tracy was saying. I mean, we started off already seeing this as a recovery year. Good rains after 2 consecutive years of droughts. So we're already on good footing, and the regulations and us understanding through the pathways that the colleagues have just explained now, were only just enabling us to know where the blockages are. But the hard work of putting the crop on the ground and doing all of those things, that was the work already done. So I would say the sector has been relatively resilient, but having more frequent information, good cooperation amongst all stakeholders is a key ingredient in all of this.
I think that's a very important point to close at, because it links up with what I picked from everyone else here. Mogeza talked about the tracker, which allowed, people who would naturally be competitors, but cooperating, as you're saying, sharing information. You talked about, the stress that the sector was under, but was able to really survive that, which is, you can argue, a definition of resilience. Information sharing and communication. So I think you have raised some important points, but Fedi, I want to take up from where you were mentioning about the vulnerable members of our society? Because I have two questions, one which I'll just bring it under one, from Andres Fori as well as Siatlankosi. And what they want to know is precisely around that, the population dynamics. We know the nature of our country in terms of poverty dynamics, inequality, and the job losses you mentioned. That's what Fori wants to know. And the question is, during this period, but most importantly, going forward, is that how did we do in terms of servicing as well as protecting the vulnerable members of our society? So the population dynamics around that and the distribution. But going forward, because the fact that the sector did well, it is not an indication that we address all challenges, because we have not. We still have a lot. But how do we use this as a springboard, to go forward to make sure that we address such issues? So the population dynamics in terms of high end and low end, as well as jobs were lost. I don't think we have the last tally, and we're not sure whether as we go further or we get outside the situation, there will be no further job losses. And these are, I think, real life situations, right? So the sector, how did it do in that context? Anyone want to start? Maybe Tracy, because you had a chart presenting about poverty in urban centers versus rural and so forth. I'll give you that opportunity to go first.
Okay. So maybe I can start. I can start with some hard numbers, because the great team behind this has actually made some calculations for us since
Awesome.
that question came in. So unfortunately, with respect to income numbers, we don't have such high frequency data. So we don't necessarily have updated data with respect to the impact that COVID had on that number. But if we look pre-COVID, if you look at the lower poverty boundary in urban centers, so that's looking at an income of around 4,800 Rand a month, about 19% of the urban population falls underneath that. If you go up to the higher poverty boundary, which is around 9,500 Rand a month, then you're looking at about 25% of the urban population that sits below that. So around 75% of the urban population would be sitting above that poverty number. Of course, we know that the impact of COVID, the additional job losses, that number would change, but at least that gives us a reasonable starting point.
Perhaps if I may jump in on there, because this is a question that probably some people are having in mind. We are sitting here talking about the great fruits of agriculture, but there are still these millions of people that are going to bed without food out there. The question then is, what are the issues? And I think there we need to be careful not to put a lot of pressure on agriculture, because one of the key issues that contributes to this is people being generally out of employment with other sectors, because it's no longer the issue of maybe pricing of food or anything. Now the question is to say, how does each sector play a part to absorb as many people as they can, so that tomorrow they can be able to afford all of these foods that we are talking about here. And I think on that point, this seems soft, but I think it is crucial. This issue of PPP, that we have seen all of this energy of business and private sector and society working together during the pandemic. I think that's the energy we need to capitalize on, not only on agriculture, but also in other sectors of the economy going forward.
I think on a broader basis, Matlo, if you look at the concept that was introduced by Wandile now, he talks about affordability. The inverse of it is that we also need to look at the availability of food. If you look at the stats, you have got 40,000 commercial farmers. You have got 300,000 smallholder farmers, and you have got almost 2.3 million subsistence farmers. What is that we can do to ensure that the production at these other two spheres of smallholder and subsistence comes in to make that cushion in terms of those who are in the rural spaces? And the importance of now going to household food security, ensuring that there is availability of food and feed also at that level is very important, because you need to have both a protein source at that particular level. So I think our argument and our debate should also center around how do we deal with issues around food availability outside of the affordability space, and ensure that we also touch base on issue around inclusivity, because most of the time when you talk about this sector, we're talking about a sector where we paint a picture of prosperity, but in terms of participation, there are issues that we also have got to deal with.
Matlo, if I can add
Yes,
these
please.
two concepts, and this links back to this, what we presented as a portfolio approach, or I think we need to debate this and think about this in terms of development, where we talked about the broadening of the base, exactly to Moketsa's point. How can we make this, we have the big numbers, so the employment numbers that we can really kick, and it comes out of the NDP, is in that space where we can grow the base broader. In other words, with the smallholders and the household farms, how can we boost productivity? If you go into the value chain and go and look at our food system, there are the bigger markets in the urban centers where you need big volumes of food, and you need it cost effective, to your point, accessible and affordable. And this is where you need this portfolio approach, where you need your large scale commercial, your medium, your large scale. So you need this whole portfolio approach. We need to figure out the support at each level, and then combine those levels then with the food system. And this is where also the markets come into play. There's the dynamics between local and international. So export markets, we need to look beyond our local borders. We have to grow in exports, because our market is simply, otherwise we're going to cap the growth opportunities and the jobs that we can create in these sectors. Not only on primary products, but also the opportunity of processed products. We can push that. This does not mean that we exclude the local markets, and local markets both in the urban and the rural areas. So if we split those out, and we really focus on what are the opportunities in exports, local, rural, and formal, informal, and really start to focus and narrow down, is it capital, is it infrastructure, is it extension services, these preconditions that we need to focus on. They're actually very value chain specific and product specific.
Okay, well, and I think that's also a key point in those rural, informal and formal value chain, is that you can't have a system that fits all possibilities. And some of the weaknesses that were exposed was the fact that the areas that you're talking about, fairly informal and rural, the infrastructure as well as these value chains were not as strong as in the mainstream value chains. Urban centers, there was food, there was enough products, but sometimes it is the movement into these other areas that are underserviced, and I think is an important thing that going forward we must look into. But the one point that I think I cannot leave it without a discussion is that the agriculture and agro processing master plans came during the presentation, and for me they also highlighted a higher priority area, at least in the context of where government is doing, and is also setting a base for now and going forward, to some degree addressing some of these challenges, even though I understand that the design came prior to the pandemic. But how important is this, and what kind of support would be needed? As you were saying, agriculture alone is not going to address the issues. Government alone is not going to solve all problems. Neither can private sector on its own deal with these issues. But how do we unpack this going forward to address some of the issues that we just said are there and have been there for a long period? Wandile, you seem to be interested in taking the first shot.
No, I mean, I'm interested because I think this story of the master plan is very important, not only on a recovery, because we are growing as the sector, but for me it begins to introduce an important dynamics which Freddie had referred to on, because if you look at it at the design, it talks about the areas which have a growth potential. Your Eastern Cape, KZN, Limpopo, that is what the master plan is looking at. And I think we need to look at it with the same energy, private sector as well as government, to say how do we meet each other halfway on really unlocking growth as well as job creation in those areas. I think that master plan is crucial.
Yeah, so the opportunities for investment, isn't it, Wandile? If we can have this in an environment where, and there was a question on it, I think John Purchase asked it also in the feed. Yes. We was asking, how do we had this example of pork, the informal sector, when we did this analysis on African swine fever. And we looked at how big are potentially those numbers. And that informal sector, it's big. There's a lot of things happening there. Question is, a lot of times people, they're operating in an economy that's not well tracked, and the question is, can we do more in those economies and actually commercialize and formalize and grow those specific sectors? And that's, I think, where this partnership that you're talking about between government and private sectors coming in. So I think on John's question on how can we generate more of that data, it's a crucial component, and that all researchers, we think we need to sit around a table and really look at available data, and maybe Stats SA can also help to triangulate and bring forth more the opportunities that are sitting in these sectors that we are not delving into.
Okay. Now the admission, I think, is there in terms of the data gaps that we are having. If you look at the agricultural census by Stats SA 2017, and you look at the analysis that was done for 2020 by Bfap, you realize that there are those what I would call minor industries that we still have got data that we can deal with. But coming back to the master plan, I think the biggest issue is around social compacting between industry, labor, and communities, to ensure that whatever that we agree on would be sector-wide and would tie us for a foreseeable future. Specifically with the different depositions that we have got to do for the NDP. I think it goes in line with what we have been doing as government, starting from the Badat days, going to the sector plans, now going to the AMP. I think that once we compact, we will be able to then drag everybody within the industry towards achieving the goals that we have always been aspiring to achieve.
Okay. So I'm happy that you see it as an extension as well as an implementation almost plan of the NDP, because people are concerned that it is one of those documents that gathers dust. But anyway, we're about to run out of time, so maybe I should just go around and ask in 20 to 30 seconds, just to give the main highlight. I mean, there's plenty, just the main highlight of this baseline for this year. I'll start on my left and going around. Tracy, you have plenty, but just one.
So I think I've already spoken for more than an hour about the baseline, so I probably don't have a lot to add. But to me, it's just to highlight the positive aspect, agriculture's performance, I think, especially this year in a really difficult environment, is really something to be commended. And I think, to latch on to points that have already been made, the opportunity to pick up, to keep the momentum in terms of the public-private partnerships that ran through this crisis, and to make sure we utilize that to ignite growth going forward.
Wandile?
For me, agriculture has a potential. That's what I pick up from the baseline. But there are certain key prerequisites which I think all stakeholders needs to confront and be open and work on those prerequisites in order to achieve the growth prospects that we all think of.
All right. Freddy, the team?
I'll link on to Wandile, and I'll say those prerequisites, we need to implement them. Otherwise, we will see a baseline growth, which we're projecting to be relatively flat. So we'll have this nice spike of weather-induced output, a nice shock on depreciation of the exchange rate, but we'll come back to slower growth numbers unless if we implement these preconditions that Wandile was talking about.
Okay, and Mogeza, your last word.
Yes, my last word would be agriculture is growing. In its growth comes expectations from all people who are participating that there would be changes in terms of transformation within the sector. and there is presentation in terms of the data that we are having that we can transform and ensure that agriculture grows for all who are within our sector, to ensure that within the value chains we have got maximum participation of black people.
Okay. Thanks very much. I think I got the picture, and in summary, it's partnership, it's prerequisites, it's investment and transformation for inclusive participation and inclusive growth. So I think I would like to end it right here. I think we've gone over time, but your inputs were very valuable. I think just now, before we go to closure, I just need to go back to our participants who have been with us for over 2 hours now, and some of them have sent a flurry of questions. Unfortunately, we can't address all of them in this panel, but we'll certainly give feedback on them through our platforms. Now, for the closure, I would want to invite Aubrey Rottenbach from UPSET to do the closing of the 2020 Bfap Baseline launch.
As the biggest commercial financial lender, it's an absolute privilege for us to be associated with Bfap and this baseline presentation. It has always been a memorable event that one used to watch and mark on your calendar. Unfortunately, this year it's a different format, but I think the positive around is that a lot more people will have access to this. I think for us it's very important. I think with the current crisis and the COVID-19 that we're experiencing, part of our problem is that there's not specific models to go and try and stimulate or estimate what would be certain outcomes. I think this is where Bfap with a baseline is actually done us very proud and very good in terms of presenting certain scenarios. The closest that we as a bank could get was the financial crisis of 2008 to try and derive at a model to see what it's going to end up. With Bfap, with the different scenarios and the baseline, it allows us to have a long-term view, and we're very proud to be associated with Bfap. I think also the second thing is that you would have heard a lot about value chains, which is so important, and the value of agriculture for South Africa as a whole. As a bank, it's for us as ABSA a very important sector, and it's also one of the few sectors that will have positive growth during the 2020 year, where we're in dire strait of a sector having to contribute positively to our economy. I think going forward, we are thanking all the people for joining. We know it's difficult circumstances. We think that together we can make a difference and we can get through this. So we're applying as a bank to everybody watching to play their part. And then I think just as a last comment, we've got an opportunity to take care of our local industry. So please be sure that you support our local industries. We also just as a last need to thank everybody, all farmers, producers, that under difficult circumstances has been able to contribute towards South Africa, the greater good, and as well as the economy. We're also thanking people playing in the different value chains, that's not producers, or we're thinking about the logistical people, we thank them. And then, once again, to Bfap, thank you for the work. I know that you're involved with a lot more than just the baseline, but we thank you for that and your contribution towards South African agriculture. Please be safe and hope to see you next year. Thank you.
Once again, this is an opportunity for me to give my final thoughts and thank everyone who has participated in this Bfap Baseline launch. I think a number of people have put in sufficient effort. A lot of resources were spent in making sure that we have a successful launch. But before the launch, there is a lot of research work that goes behind the data gathering, and this goes to the whole Bfap team, We have an awesome team that really works very hard in making sure that we get the numbers. Not only that we get the numbers, but we get them right. And at the end of the day, we have a product like the launch, we have a product like the presentation, we have product like the books and other Bfap, outcome that we share with the general public out there. Secondly, we have partners in government, in the private sector, in the industry, and we work with them throughout the year at all times. And they are the pillars of our support and also contributed to this. I just want to thank them, even though I wouldn't mention specific members. The presenters today, all of them, they did a very good job from the opening up until the closing. I think the presentations were very good, particularly in times like this, and that shows the extent and the degree to which they have prepared for this opportunity. And on my own behalf, I just want to thank all of you for taking so much time, and I would like to apologize for the technical glitches that we had at the beginning. These are some of the things that are completely out of our control, but we have to deal and work within those. So with all those words, in my mother tongue we say, which basically means that for whoever I've offended or for whatever mistake I have made, I hope you'll find in your hearts to forgive me for that. Thank you very much.